Think travel is tough today. In the Middle Ages, one wrong turn could mean plague bandits, or never being seen again. This wasn't a vacation, it was survival. So you think you're adventurous. You bought a hiking backpack that costs more than rent, downloaded 3 offline maps, and now you're ready to find yourself in the wild. But let me stop you right there, Indiana Jones, because you, my friend, have never travelled in 1347. Forget delayed flights or bedbugs in budget hostels. Try dysentery wolf attacks and being mugged by a priest with a dagger and a grudge. Back then, travel wasn't an experience. It was a gamble. Like Russian roulette, but the gun is made of mud, your map is a vague rumour, and 6 out of 6 chambers have the plague. People didn't travel because it was fun. They did it because they were forced to by famine, war, holy guilt, or sheer masochism. Even then, Mo said, "Nay, I'd rather die in my village with my chickens and chronic lice." Let's begin with the obvious roads. You know those things we take for granted today that let us Uber to brunch? In medieval Europe, road was a generous term. Most were muddy veins of despair that turned into rivers when it rained, and death traps when it didn't. Paved roads were rare, and when they did exist, they were often Roman leftovers, meaning they hadn't been maintained since Julius Caesar had baby teeth. The moment you left the gates of your town, your odds of surviving plummeted faster than a medieval bridge during flood season. Bandits lurked in every bush, highwaymen roamed in packs, and anyone who looked friendly probably just wanted to check your pockets while complimenting your shoes. Some even dressed as monks because nothing screams easy target like a traveller who trusts people wearing robes and holding sticks. And oh, the clothes! Let's be clear, you were not packing for weather, you were packing for penance. Wool everything, heavy, itchy, full-body sweat traps, shoes made of wood or dead animals with 0 arch support and 100% chance of fungus. If it rained, you got wet. If it snowed, you died. If it was sunny, congratulations, you now smell like a boiled sheep. Don't even start with, what about carriages? Sure, if you were rich, you got a horse-drawn box with no suspension and a guarantee of hemorrhoids. If you were poor, aka 90% of people you walked through mud-shit corpses and occasionally your own blood. No sidewalks, no milestones. Just the smell of open sewers and the motivational screams of passing mercenaries. Now let's talk time. A trip from Paris to Rome today takes about 2 hours by plane. In 1347, 3 months. That's if you didn't get detained by bandits poisoned by inn food, or drafted into someone else's private war along the way. Most medieval trips involved multiple near-death experiences, several emotional breakdowns, and at least one deeply regrettable encounter with a goat. Food on the road. Think less Michelin star and more mystery meat. Surprise. Travellers often brought hard bread, dried fish and prayer. Inns might serve stew made of whatever was still twitching in the backyard that morning. Sanitary conditions. If your bowl didn't still have someone else's teeth marks, it was considered luxury. And no, you couldn't just pop into a town for a break. Every village was its own tiny kingdom of paranoia. Strangers were suspected of being thieves, witches, or French. Towns might refuse you entry, charge you foot taxes, or simply let the dogs chase you out while the locals watched and placed bets. But what about safety, you cry? Ha! Medieval safety was a joke with a tragic punchline. If you were attacked, there was no 911, no police, no help. Just your own scream echoing off the trees, and maybe a squirrel judging your lack of upper body strength. Some travellers carried weapons, but fighting off trained bandits with a rusty knife is like bringing a spoon to a joust. Religious pilgrims had it just as bad, if not worse. Sure, they were protected by the church, but so were some of the robbers. Many religious routes became murder hotspots with better branding. You walked for days to see a holy relic, only to get robbed right outside the monastery gates by someone quoting psalms. And let's not forget about disease. Remember, this was the year 1347, as in meet the Black Death. Travelling meant exposure to every possible strain of medieval horror. Dirty water, rotten food, people coughing blood in your face. And since no one understood germs, yet the standard cure was bleed them and hope they don't die, guess what, they died. If you were a woman, travelling added an extra layer of nightmare. You were either assumed to be a runaway wife, a witch, or a prostitute, or some tragic combo of the three. Rape, harassment, and general dehumanization were so common, it was considered safer for women to disguise themselves as monks. Yes, monks. Because celibacy was safer than femininity. Now imagine doing all of this, with no toilet, no privacy, no soap. When nature called, you found a bush, or worse, a communal toilet built over a river. One slip and you became medieval plumbing. In many towns, sewage ran through the streets, which means every step was a dance with disease. So why did anyone travel? Desperation, faith, greed? Or they were really, really lost. Maps were hand-drawn lies, often featuring dragons or the edge of the world. Here be monsters wasn't metaphor. It was the cartographer's way of saying, I have no clue, good luck. But here's the kicker. Despite everything, the death, the disease, the dysentery, people still travelled. Because somehow curiosity, belief, or sheer stupidity kept them moving. Maybe they hoped to find a better life. Maybe they were running from a worse one. Or maybe, just maybe, they thought it can't be that bad. Can't. Spoiler, it was. So you've stepped outside the safety of your quaint, plague-ridden little village. Congratulations. You're now officially medieval roadkill in waiting. Let me introduce you to your new best friend's potholes, the size of oxen weather, with the emotional range of a tyrant and, of course, roving bands of robbers, whose career goals involve stabbing strangers before breakfast. If you're lucky, they just take your money. If you're unlucky, well, have you ever seen your own intestines? The medieval road wasn't a road in the way we understand it. No asphalt, no signs, no paint lines. Just a slightly less grassy strip of dirt where previous travellers had not yet been murdered. Even the word road feels like propaganda. In many places the main path was whatever the cows hadn't chewed up yet. Travellers learned to tell the time by how deep the cartwheels sank in the mud. Morning ankle deep, afternoon waist-high sorrow. As for infrastructure, don't even bother asking. If something broke a bridge, a path, a whole town, no one fixed it. The local lord was usually too busy planning a war, excommunicating someone, or dying of gout. Bridges collapsed regularly, and rivers didn't come with warning signs. You crossed when you dared. Or you didn't. Many travellers carried their own planks or waded through clutching their belongings like soggy prayers. Now let's talk about bandits. Romanticised in movies, yes. Realistically, they were medieval LinkedIn professionals of theft and trauma. A single road could be claimed by multiple gangs, each with their own methods. Some preferred the ambush. Others just walked up and punched you in the face. Think of them as unscheduled toll booths with knives. You paid with coins, blood, or dignity, sometimes all three. One popular scam involved fake road signs or guides who would offer to lead you safely, only to lead you straight into a bush where their friends were waiting with clubs and questionable dental hygiene. They weren't picky. Pilgrims, merchants, nobles, wandering peasants, everyone was lootable. Robbery was one of the few egalitarian practices in the Middle Ages, and don't count on chivalry to save you. Knights, many of them were the problem. Out-of-work knights, especially between crusades or peasant uprisings, often turned to roadside robbery. Armed to the teeth, armoured like walking bank vaults, and deeply bored, these guys were Grand Theft Auto Joust Edition. They didn't care about your prayers. They cared if your boots looked shiny enough to sell. Travellers had to get creative. Some dressed in rags to appear poor. Others pretended to be monks, though actual monks were often robbed too, because nothing screams hidden treasure like someone carrying a mysterious box and muttering Latin. Some travellers even carried fake plague symptoms to scare people off. Bubonic cosplay, if you will. It sometimes worked until it didn't. Then you just got robbed and burned. Now, if the robbers didn't get you, the road probably would. And by road, I mean the treacherous, gnarled pathways that existed in a constant state of, you thought you could walk here. Tree roots, ankle-breaking stones, Animal dung and sudden drop-offs made every step a gamble. Horses fared only slightly better if they didn't break a leg, die of exhaustion, or get eaten by wolves pretending to be bushes. Oh yes, wolves! Let's not forget the wildlife. Packs of wolves often followed travellers for miles waiting for a twisted ankle or a poor night's rest. They were opportunists, and smarter than most humans. Boars also roam the forests, less subtle, more tusk-based. Bears rare, but terrifying. There were even stories of travellers being dragged off in the night by wild dogs who had developed a taste for pilgrims. Let's say, for argument's sake, you made it to a village for rest. The village might let you in, or not. Many towns had gates and watchmen whose primary job was to stare suspiciously at strangers and decide whether your face looked like it deserved access to fresh water. Travellers could be turned away for being poor diseased foreign, too clean, not clean enough, or we just don't like your aura. Assuming you were let in the local inn was often just someone's barn with hay rats and the faint memory of a mattress. You'd share a bed with strangers, sometimes multiple, and no one ever asked if you wanted to. Beds were communal, so were lice. If you were lucky, you got to sleep next to someone who snored. If not, you woke up missing your boots and your soul. Speaking of boots, good luck keeping yours. Footwear was a hot commodity. Most travellers walked barefoot by the end of their journey. Boots fell apart, got stolen, or simply rotted off your feet. The average medieval traveller's toes resembled boiled chestnuts, and the smell, somewhere between despair and week-old fish stew. Now let's sprinkle in a little bureaucracy just for fun. Many regions required travel permits, pieces of parchment that said this person is allowed to not die here. Problem local lords changed these rules hourly, and your paper meant nothing 10 miles later. If you didn't have the right pass imprisonment, or a fine so large you'd have to sell your horse, then walk back barefoot through Bandit Alley. At certain checkpoints, usually run by minor lords or their bastard nephews, you'd be stopped, questioned, searched and taxed. For what breathing? Passing through, having too many teeth. There were road tolls, bridge tolls, gate tolls, and one infamous region in France that charged a toll for crossing a shadow. Yes, a shadow. Bureaucracy was just extortion wearing a fancy hat. Even the seasons worked against you. Summer brought heat stroke and dehydration. Winter froze your face off and turned roads into death slides. Spring flooded everything. Autumn bandit season. The only time travel was slightly safer was during major religious festivals because robbers were too busy repenting, or pretending to, then robbing you right after. You might ask, were there any safe routes? Technically, yes. Trade routes patrolled by mercenaries or guarded by guilds had less murder per mile. But you paid extra for that privilege, and even then, safety was relative. One group of mercenaries protecting your caravan might be the same group that robs you next week when the contract ends. Loyalty in the Middle Ages was like soup, thin, warm, and easily spilled. Stories spread fast about what happened on these roads. One popular tale involved a man who stopped to help a crying child on the roadside. Moments later, the child pulled a knife and 5 other orphans emerged from the bushes and robbed him blind. Medieval Robin Hoods. Nope. Just traumatized children with knives and ambition. Still want to travel? Good news. If you survived the first 50 miles, you were officially a hardened traveller, scarred, paranoid, and possibly hallucinating from lack of sleep. You began to develop the 1,000-yard stare. You spoke less, ate faster, trusted no one. Congratulations, you are now fully medieval. And that's the reality. The road wasn't just dangerous, it was aggressively dangerous. It hated you. It wanted to break your spirit, steal your dignity, and bury your corpse without a name. It was the ultimate test of willpower and stupidity. And most people, honesty, just said no thanks and stayed home. But for the rare few who dared, the journey was unforgettable, mainly because they never stopped bleeding. Picture this: you're standing at a fork in a muddy road. One path disappears into a gloomy forest that smells like regret. The other vanishes behind a hill occupied by goats who look unusually judgmental. There are no signs, no arrows, No friendly voice chirping from a phone telling you to turn left in 500 feet. Just wind worry, and maybe a passing farmer who says that way's cursed, but good luck. Welcome to medieval navigation. No maps, no compasses for the common folk, and certainly no reliable directions. If you were a traveller in the Middle Ages, you didn't find your way, you survived it. You asked for directions, received conflicting answers, then picked the route that felt least like a death trap. Spoiler, it was still a death trap. Maps existed, yes, but calling them helpful is generous. Most looked like they'd been drawn during a fever dream by someone who'd never left their monastery. Rivers bent at right angles, mountains looked like giant teeth, and towns floated in space like drunk constellations. Some even had dragons drawn in the corners, not as warnings, just as decoration. 'Cause why not? The most popular maps were Mappe Mundi, beautiful, circular, and completely useless. They were theological diagrams more than navigational tools. Jerusalem always sat at the centre, because obviously, and everything else radiated out in a confusing swirl of guesswork, scripture and hope. If you used one to travel from London to York, you'd probably end up in a swamp in Denmark wondering why the sun was laughing at you. So how did people actually get around? They asked strangers. That's right, human GPS. Except your guide might have early onset dementia, a grudge against travellers, or just terrible spatial awareness. One wrong conversation, and you'd be 3 days off course sleeping in a pigsty while swearing revenge on a man named Osric who said you can't miss it. You could, and you did. The irony, locals rarely knew what was 10 miles away. Most medieval people never travelled far from home. Their entire universe was their village, a nearby forest, and the vague understanding that somewhere out there is France. Asking directions was like asking your cat for stock advice. You might get an answer. It won't help. Even when people try to help, they describe locations using terrifying landmarks. Take the path past the gallows, turn right at the haunted well, then straight until you smell burning sulphur. Oh, sure, thanks, Agnes, that sounds super welcoming. I'll just stroll past Satan's footpath like it's no big deal. No wonder so many travellers ended up dead lost or enrolled in a cult by accident. Monasteries were often the most reliable sources of direction if you could find one, and if the monks hadn't taken a vow of silence. But even then, reliable meant you got a hand-drawn diagram of squiggly lines, and a lot of Latin phrases like, "Haec draconis, here be dragons." To this day, we don't know if they meant literal dragons or just, really bad neighbours. And let's talk about roads not being marked. Because sometimes they were just badly. Wooden signs might point vaguely in a direction, often with town names misspelled by someone who'd never learned to spell. Weather war or wild pigs knocked over most signs within a month, so you're stuck squinting at a faded plank that says to Scagglethorpe with a question mark carved in blood. Reassuring. Oh, and don't even try to travel at night. Darkness was medieval nature's way of saying you're going to die now. There were no lantern-lit roads, no moonlit cobblestones, just pitch-black horror-rustling bushes and the certainty that something was watching. Even locals stayed indoors after sunset, muttering prayers and hoping the ghosts ignored their chimney smoke. So how did anyone make it to their destination slowly? Very slowly. Travellers moved in groups when possible, mostly to avoid becoming bandit snacks. Caravan leaders sometimes had a vague idea of the route passed down orally from someone who survived it 20 years ago. Directions weren't measured in miles. They were measured in how many legs of a goat you'd eat before reaching the next town. Measurements were hilarious. No one had GPS coordinates, obviously. Instead, they used units like a day's walk, which varied wildly depending on terrain, weather, and whether or not you had dysentery. One man's nearby was another man's 2-week soul-crushing odyssey through the swamp of sadness. When someone said just over the hill, it usually meant good luck, sucker. And don't even bring up language barriers. Europe was a fractured mess of dialects, accents, and regional gibberish. Asking for directions in southern Italy using northern French got you nothing but blank stares or a slap with a fish. Even English wasn't standardized. Left might mean west, or it might mean fall into the ditch and scream. Communicating with hand gestures often worked better, assuming no one mistook them for rude signs. Religious symbols helped a bit. Pilgrimage routes were often marked with little shrines, crosses, or the occasional bone of a saint nailed to a tree. You followed those and hoped they weren't leading you to a forgotten plague pit. Some churches tried to distribute travel guides, basically monk-written Yelp reviews of local roads. 5 stars, only 2 robbers, and a surprisingly clean well. Another method: rumours. Gossip was medieval TripAdvisor. People heard from their cousin's friend's uncle that a certain road was clear, or that the town of Wibbleston was cursed this week, so maybe avoid it. Of course, by the time you got there, the road was on fire and the town had renamed itself New Wibbleston after the last one burned down. Again, occasionally kings tried to fix things. Royal messengers were supposed to ride between towns delivering news and updating officials. These guys had the best chance of not dying, partly because they were fast, and partly because killing one meant a death sentence from the crown. But even they got lost. One famously ended up in the wrong kingdom and accidentally started a war. Whoops. Eventually, if you travelled enough, you developed road sense, a 6th sense born of trauma intuition and the distant sound of screaming. You learned to read the Windwatch animal tracks and smell the difference between safe village and den of thieves. If a bird flew backward or the cows mooed in Latin, you turned around. Immediately. Survival came not from knowledge but superstition with a decent success rate. In the end, medieval navigation was less about direction and more about vibes. You moved forward, backward, sideways, whatever felt less cursed. You relied on luck faith, and occasionally a talking goat named Gregory it happened. And if you made it to your destination with both legs and most of your teeth, you were a legend. Or a liar. Probably both. Imagine a world where delivering a letter could literally kill you. Not emotionally, not financially, physically. That's the job description of a medieval messenger run across bandit-infested wilderness, sleep in plaguey inns, and risk your life just so someone could say, "Tell Lord Edgar his cheese shipment is late." And you thought replying to emails was exhausting. Being a medieval messenger wasn't just a job. It was a high-risk, low-reward Olympic sport of endurance luck and not bleeding out. There were no uniforms, no badges, just a satchel, a tired horse, and a letter sealed with wax which occasionally melted off in your pants. Bonus points if the seal was from a noble, because that made you a prime target for robbers' spies and very nosy squirrels. Some messengers were official, working for king's courts or monasteries. They had titles like Royal Courier, which sounded fancy until you realised they still had to trudge through the same filth as everyone else. Their only perk, a slightly smaller chance of being stabbed. Maybe. If the bandits were literate enough to recognise the royal seal and too superstitious to steal from it. Big if. Most letters didn't even get couriers. They got whoever was heading that way. Merchant, farmer, peasant with a decent sense of direction. Congrats, you're now a part-time postal worker. There were no standard routes, no scheduled deliveries, just awkward favours and hope. Hey, take this to Norwich. And if you see my cousin, tell him I still hate him. The journey wasn't just long, it was deadly. Letters often passed through war zones, famine regions, or plague-stricken towns. Imagine the USS, but each mailbox is on fire and has fleas. Roads were blocked. Towns had quarantine gates. Some cities would literally shoot arrows at strangers on sight. So if you had a message to deliver, you'd better be fast charming or bulletproof. Ideally all 3. Oh, and did I mention most messengers travelled alone? That's right. No entourage, no bodyguards. Just you, your message, and the ever-growing sense that you're being watched by a guy with a crossbow behind that tree. Wolves loved messengers too. Not for the letters, just for the chewy, terrified legs attached to them. Messengers weren't paid much either. Usually it was a few coins, a crust of bread, and maybe a God bless you from a noble who didn't know your name. There were no tips, no insurance. If you died, the next guy would just be told, "Hey, grab that letter off his corpse and finish the job." You weren't a person. You were a delivery system with anxiety and shoes. Now here's where it gets worse. Disease. Yes, carrying letters also meant carrying plague. The worst chainmail wasn't armour, it was mail chains, literal routes where infection travelled on foot, paper and droplets. In the 14th century, when the Black Death was throwing its massive tantrum across Europe, guess who helped it spread? Yep, good old Harold the Courier unknowingly delivering both messages and microbial doom. Ink wasn't your only problem. The paper, often parchment made of animal skin, could soak up all sorts of delicious bacteria. Some letters even smelled strange, having marinated in the messenger's sweat for 3 weeks. If you were lucky, you just got an itchy rash. If you weren't, you caught something that turned your lungs into soup. Nothing says urgent memo like a side of bubonic cough. The nobles knew it too. That's why letters were sometimes fumigated. How fire! Literally waving the message through smoke like a cursed marshmallow, or dousing it in vinegar, or in rare cases just throwing it into a brazier and starting over because no one wanted plague parchment on their desk. One unlucky bishop died because he kissed a wax seal too passionately. Romance was different back then, but even with all the risks, letters were the lifeblood of medieval bureaucracy. Want to move an army? Send a letter. Need to accuse someone of heresy? Send a letter. Want to arrange a marriage between 2 children who've never met? Oh, you definitely send a letter. It didn't matter that half the letters arrived late or mangled or delivered by a donkey. It was still better than guessing. There were even postal systems, kind of. In the Islamic world, China and parts of Byzantium, there are impressively organised courier networks far better than the chaotic scribble fest that was Western Europe. The Mongol Empire had relay stations and fresh horses waiting every 25 miles. Europe had Dave, and Dave's one tired mule. Some cities tried to copy those systems. Venice had a primitive post. So did Paris. But it was mostly for officials. Peasants had no access. If you wanted to send a love letter to your cousin 2 villages over, don't ask, you had to walk there. Or give it to a random stranger and hope he wasn't illiterate drunk or chased by geese. And let's not ignore secrecy. Ever wonder how many letters were actually read by the people they were meant for? Not many. Interception was common. Lords opened messages like Christmas gifts, especially if they suspected gossip, sedition or juicy scandal. There were entire spy networks dedicated to stealing, forging or decoding letters. If you thought medieval warfare was about swords, you've clearly never seen a monk with a wax seal and a grudge. Some people got paranoid and used ciphers. Crude codes, reversed Latin, invisible ink made from lemon juice, real 07 stuff minus the gadgets. But most people weren't clever enough to use them, so letters often began with lines like "burn this after reading" or "kill the bearer if caught," which did wonders for the morale of the poor guy carrying it. Despite all this, messages still moved. Slowly, painfully, mysteriously, but they moved. You could be in York and send a note to Rome, and if the stars aligned, the messenger didn't die, and no one set fire to it, you might get a reply 6 months later. By then the war was over, your marriage was annulled, and the cheese shipment was now historical fossil. But hey, communication. And yes, there were mail carriers who became legends. Men who braved mountains, bandits, plagues, and unspeakable outhouses just to deliver one letter. We don't remember their names. History doesn't care. But they existed. Somewhere a rotting scroll in an abbey records their death with the line "perished en route." Message unread. Truly the medieval equivalent of left on red. So next time you groan about Gmail crashing or a late Amazon package, remember this: some poor bastard in 1352 carried a waxy scroll 700 miles across war-torn lands through infected towns without food, without Google Maps, just to deliver a message that said, "Please send more turnips," and then died. Alone. In a ditch. Covered in turnips. You finally survived the wolves, the bandits, and that deeply suspicious man selling blessed goat milk in a swamp. You're exhausted, muddy, hungry, and your feet now resemble boiled cabbage. But look up ahead. A warm glowing inn. A haven. A sanctuary. A lie. Because if you think medieval inns were cosy, let me lovingly throw a chamber pot at your face. Let's get this straight. A medieval inn was not a rustic bed and breakfast run by a sweet old couple named Harold and Mabel. It was more like a haunted barn operated by someone named Piers the Unwashed, who charged you to sleep in his disease-ridden hay pile beside a drunk shoemaker and 3 rats who paid no rent. Welcome, he'd say. We have stew and somewhere to die. Beds, plural, ha! Most inns had one giant communal mattress or just a floor with vague hopes. If you were lucky, it was filled with straw. If you were unlucky, it was filled with straw, fleas, lice, and the pungent memory of last night's vomiting merchant. Don't expect sheets. Don't expect privacy. Expect things that crawl and bite and occasionally whisper in Latin. You didn't rent a room. You rented space. A spot on a bench. A square of floor. Maybe a stool in the corner next to the fire and under the dripping corpse of a chicken being preserved via smoke. You'd sleep upright if the inn was full, and it was always full. Medieval people didn't have Airbnbs, they had overbooked misery. Even if you somehow snagged a bed, you were sharing it. With strangers, of unknown origin, with unknown diseases. This was normal. Men cuddled for warmth. Women did the same or pretended to be men to avoid being groped. If someone snored, you dealt with it. If someone died during the night, we'll move over. They paid for the space until sunrise. Now let's talk cleanliness, or rather its complete and joyous absence. Inns were rarely cleaned unless you count sweeping filth from one side of the room to the other as sanitation. Chamber pots were rarely emptied. Mould decorated the walls like medieval wallpaper. The air was a delightful cocktail of sweat smoke, urine mildew and despair. Washing yourself was optional and discouraged. Inns often had one shared wash basin filled with water that hadn't been changed since the Crusades. You dipped your face in it and came up with new friends, amoebas, bacteria, maybe a medieval toe someone lost. If someone brought soap, they were considered wealthy, suspicious, or a wizard. The food didn't help either. Dinner was stew, always stew. It had no name, no clear ingredients, and no beginning or end. It just existed simmering for weeks. Each night the innkeeper would toss in whatever he found, onion bits, rat chunks, questionable meat, a coin someone accidentally swallowed. Guests didn't ask what it was. They just prayed it didn't move. Drinks were safer, kind of. Ale was preferred over water because water was basically liquid roulette. Ale at least had been boiled, unless it hadn't. In which case, congratulations, you now had explosive diarrhea in a building with no plumbing and 12 other people sleeping around you. Good luck holding your reputation and your stomach. Let's not forget the pests, fleas, lice, bedbugs, mice rats, and possibly demonic spirits if the place had been built on a cursed turnip patch. Travellers often arrived with their own bugs, so by morning the inn was basically a medieval petting zoo where everything itched. Some folks actually preferred sleeping outside the inn on the roof or in a tree just to avoid the mattress of biological warfare. And still people came, because the alternative was sleeping in the forest where the guest list included wolves, murderous hermits, and weather with homicidal tendencies. Inns were bad, but nature was worse. At least indoors, the things trying to kill you didn't have fangs, just knives, poor hygiene, and heavy snoring. Oh, and did I mention theft? Because yes, inns were hotspots for robbery. If you fell asleep too hard, you'd wake up with no boots, no money, and possibly a new name if someone stole your identity. The innkeeper wouldn't care. He might be the thief. His cousin probably was. They'd shrug and say, shouldn't have slept so deeply, and God help you if you were the thief. Inns had their own justice systems, rough, immediate, and public. You'd be dragged outside, shouted at by everyone who ever lost a spoon and beaten with whatever was nearby. Then thrown into the local river tied to a chair made of regrets. Trial by inn patrons highly efficient, rarely fair. There were some attempts at standards. Certain guilds or monasteries kept guest houses for pilgrims slightly cleaner, slightly quieter, with a higher ratio of crosses to murder. But even then overcrowding was common, and monks weren't immune to theft or flatulence. The phrase peaceful retreat often ended with someone vomiting holy wine into a bucket. Some wealthy travellers brought their own bedding. Smart, right? Except it marked you as rich, which meant you now had the attention of everyone who wanted a peace robbers, desperate innkeepers, or fellow guests who believed sharing is caring, especially when it involved your goose-feather pillow and not theirs made of straw and probable disease. Toilets hilarious. Some inns had holes in the floor, some had outhouses, most had nothing. Guests relieved themselves outside in buckets or down a chute that emptied into a river or street. That's right, your lovely riverside inn was probably dumping last night's stew and someone's intestines into the same stream you washed your face in. Every once in a while an inn became infamous. There were stories of murder inns, establishments designed to kill travellers, rob them and toss the bodies in the pig pen. Real stories, real pigs, real protein recycling. These weren't urban legends, they were rural warnings. Locals would whisper, "Don't stay at the Red Thorn. No one leaves with their kidneys. And don't expect customer service." There were no room keys, no complimentary mints, no turn-down service unless you count being turned down for food. Complaints were met with a glare, a club, or a quiet suggestion to take it up with the rats. If your bed was broken, you got a stick. If your soup was spoiled, you got less soup. Yet somehow people survived. They staggered out of these places with lice in their beards and questionable memories. They told others, "You have to try the Red Boar Inn. The stew didn't kill me. It was the highest praise one could give." And inns thrived because travellers were desperate, filthy, and deeply afraid of sleeping in the woods. In a way, these inns were the medieval internet. You met strangers, shared gossip, contracted viruses, occasionally got robbed. Sometimes you even found love or something close enough to it in a dark corner while pretending you weren't already engaged to someone else in another town. Connections were made, some were infections, most were both. So the next time you check into a hotel, run your fingers along a clean white sheet, breathe in the lavender air freshener and complain that the mini-fridge's warm pause. Think of the medieval traveller huddled in a louse-infested hay pile, spooning a wheezing blacksmith for body heat while rats held counsel on his forehead. And maybe, just maybe, be grateful. You know what modern travellers worry about flight delays? Lost luggage. Maybe getting rained on during their wine tasting. Adorable. In the Middle Ages, weather wasn't an inconvenience, it was a god with a grudge, and you were just a meat puppet trying not to die in a muddy ditch while the sky hurled freezing death at your face. No forecasts, no umbrellas, just prayer and deeply questionable cloaks. Let's start with rain. Medieval rain didn't sprinkle, it attacked. Roads turned to rivers. Fields became swamps. Your boots filled with water, your cloak soaked through, and your underpants. They became a portable bog. Travellers routinely lost carts, animals, or their sanity trying to cross what had been a dry trail 6 hours earlier. Nature flipped moods faster than a drunk bishop at a wedding. You might think, well, they had roofs right, technically, yes. Straw wood or whatever was handy. But let me be clear. Medieval roofing had all the waterproof integrity of a wet sponge. Leaks weren't occasional, they were features. Rain dripped onto your face at night, and if you complained, people would say, "That's just the angels weeping, comforting, so was pneumonia." Travelling during rain meant slipping down hills, wading through rivers that didn't exist yesterday, and watching your cart vanish into what used to be a road, and was now a tragic metaphor. If your horse didn't drown, it probably sprained an ankle, and if you didn't drown, congratulations, just hypothermia, then mild victory. And then came the mud. Glorious ankle-sucking, soul-swallowing mud. Horses sank in it. People vanished in it. Shoes were lost forever to the swampy grip of sodden earth that had seen more tears than the entire cast of Hamlet. Wagons got stuck so deep you had to abandon them and drag your cargo on your back. Welcome to the spa treatment you never wanted. Let's say you somehow pushed through that mess. Congratulations, it's winter now. Hope you brought your fur-lined despair. There were no snowplows, no salting trucks, no insulated boots. Just you, a paper-thin wool cloak, and a rising awareness that your toes had turned blue and were no longer responding to emotional cues. Frostbite was the universe's way of saying, you should have stayed home. Snow in medieval Europe wasn't magical, it wasn't quiet and romantic. It was sharp, relentless, and a brilliant shade of we're all going to die. Travellers froze in place, literally. Frozen corpses were sometimes found upright, still holding their walking sticks mid-stride. Locals would just nod and say, "Looks like he took the northern route," and don't get cocky about summer either. Summer meant droughts, dust, heat stroke and dehydration. Cloaks became ovens, skin roasted. Water sources dried up or turned into worm soup. You'd beg for a breeze, then instantly regret it, because the breeze carried every fly smell and lung-destroying pollen particle in the hemisphere. There were no ice cubes, just sweat and sobbing. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to wind. Medieval wind was a full-time villain. It knocked over carts. It blew cloaks into fires. It slammed doors shut hard enough to shatter bones and reputations. At sea, it sank ships. On land, it sandblasted your face with whatever the forest was shedding that week. Wind was nature's slapstick routine with death. Storms were entire medieval horror films. Thunder was the voice of God. Lightning, a divine punishment. People believed storms were signs of sin, so naturally if you got caught in one, someone nearby would probably start confessing loudly in case it improved the odds. I stole turnips in 1328, spare us. Lightning didn't care, it hit anyway. Floods were not rare. Rivers had no dams. Lakes had no respect. Entire towns were washed away in a single night of rain. Bridges collapsed. Roads vanished. Ferries overturned. People drowned while clinging to their chickens. And when the water receded, it left behind disease, death, and an overwhelming stench of regret. And because this is the Middle Ages, yes, weather omens were a thing. A rainbow sign of a coming famine, a red sky, witches, a sudden gust of wind, demons farting. Travellers didn't just battle the elements. They battled the fear of what the elements meant. You might be soaked cold and coughing, but what really scared you was that it might also be your fault. Did people plan around weather barely? Calendars weren't standardised. Seasons were rough guesses. There were no meteorologists, just old men staring at clouds and declaring a storm's coming. My knees said so, and they were often right, which is somehow both comforting and tragic. Now there were shelters, occasionally a barn, a rock overhang, a tree with particularly empathetic branches. But more often than not, you had to build a lean-to from despair, and whatever sticks hadn't been stolen by the last traveller. Firewood wet, kindling non-existent. Fire a cruel joke invented by dry people. And when all else failed, you just kept walking. Through storms, snow fog so thick you couldn't see your own doom approaching. People wrapped themselves in blankets, cloaks or sheep if necessary. Some carried oilcloths. Most didn't. You were wet, you were tired, and you whispered angrily into the wind. Why did I ever leave my hovel? Sickness was inevitable. Wet feet, fever, cold night pneumonia, sudden change in weather, death. There were no dry socks, no waterproof cloaks. Just hope for the best, and if you die, please fall somewhere scenic. Many towns had shrines on roads, not for decoration, but because someone always died there after a freak hailstorm or poorly timed sneeze. People invented saints just for weather. St. Medard, patron of rain protection. St. Nicholas, protector of sailors. St. Scholastica, called on during storms. You prayed to them, you begged them, and sometimes you cursed them through chattering teeth when the sky opened up and dumped holy vengeance onto your already soggy life. Yet despite it all, despite the rain, snow, sleet, sunburn, mudslides, floods, and flying chickens during gale-force winds, people still travelled. Because they had to. Or they were pilgrims. Or they believed that their business, their love, their war, or their turnip deal was more important than the sky's wrath. And sometimes, just sometimes, they were right. So the next time you cancel a trip because there's a 60% chance of drizzle, imagine a 14th century peasant walking barefoot through 6 feet of slush, carrying a sack of mouldy bread while yelling, I hope this monastery has soup. And maybe don't complain about the weather app being off by 2 degrees. Let's say you survived the mudslides, bandits and rat buffet at last night's inn. You're cold, exhausted and 30% lice, but hey, you're still breathing. That's something. You limp into the next town hoping for rest and bread, only to be greeted by a guard who says, "State your business." And where's your permit? Welcome to medieval legal hell. Hope you brought both a sword and a very flexible understanding of justice. The Middle Ages loved laws. They just didn't love consistency. Every town, fief and monastery had its own set of rules, many made up on the spot, usually by someone with a hangover and a stick. What was legal in one village could be a hanging offence in the next. And if you didn't know, too bad. Ignorance wasn't just no excuse, it was practically bait. Crossing borders wasn't just a political formality. It was a full-on risk assessment. Lords charged tolls for roads, bridges, even shadows if they were feeling spicy. You had to pay to pass, or bribe, or kneel and promise not to curse the local cows. If you didn't pay, your stuff was confiscated or your kneecaps. It depended on the guard's mood and whether his wife liked him that morning. Now let's say you accidentally walk on land owned by a noble you've never heard of. You've trespassed. Congratulations, you're now legally a threat. Some lords posted signs, most didn't. Some employed guards. Others used trapdoors, angry geese or unpaid interns with crossbows. A surprising number of trespassers ended up either imprisoned or incorporated into local scarecrow installations. And don't assume your social class would protect you. Nobles were above the law, peasants were under it, and travellers. Travellers existed in legal limbo, a sort of moving target for taxation suspicion and recreational arrest. Locals often viewed newcomers as criminals by default. After all, if you weren't guilty of something, why were you walking around like that? The legal system was a jigsaw puzzle made of worms. Courts were rare, expensive, and corrupt. Trial by jury existed, but juries were just 12 guys who all hated you for different reasons. If you were accused of something, say stealing bread or looking French, you could be sentenced with shocking speed. Due process. That's adorable. Your process involved a rope and gravity. Some regions still practice trial by ordeal. This meant you proved your innocence by surviving something awful. Hold a red-hot iron. If your hand healed cleanly somehow, you were innocent. Drown in a river. Also innocent. Float like a duck witch. Legal logic was like a medieval drinking song. It didn't have to make sense. It just had to rhyme with burn him. Carrying weapons wasn't just common, it was expected. Everyone had something sharp, blunt, or pointy nearby. Swords, daggers, hatchets, big sticks, and passive-aggressive prayer beads. If you didn't have a weapon, people assumed you were either helpless holy or hiding something more sinister. Self-defense wasn't a right, it was a full-time survival strategy. But here's the twist, defending yourself could also get you arrested. If a local tried to rob you and you injured him, guess what? You might be tried for harming a subject of the realm. That's right, the mugger might sue you, and if his cousin was the local reeve or judge, which he usually would say goodbye to your freedom, your gold, and probably your left ear. There were laws for everything. Some towns banned singing after sunset. Others fined you for wearing colours above your station. In parts of England, it was illegal for peasants to own dogs over a certain size too noble. You could be arrested for spreading rumours, killing a deer, or smiling at someone's daughter during Lent. The legal code was half Bible, half fever dream. And travel permits pure chaos. To go from one town to another, you often needed written permission signed by someone literate, wealthy, and hopefully not dead of plague. Lose it, and you were considered a vagabond, a criminal class so broad it included beggars, actors and wandering monks who looked suspiciously French. Vagabonds were whipped, branded, or worse, forced to join a monastery choir. If you did end up in court, you had two options, confess or lie well. Lawyers existed, but they weren't common, cheap, or interested in justice. Most defendants represented themselves poorly. Trials took place in churches, taverns, open fields, or someone's barn. If you were lucky, the judge was sober. If not, hope your crime rhymed with a saint's name. Punishments were delightfully over the top. Fine stocks, whippings, branding, exile, amputations, you name it. And execution, of course. Hanging, beheading, burning, and in special cases being flung from a catapult. Okay, that last one's not confirmed, but honestly, would you be surprised medieval justice was theatre with real blood and no refunds? But wait, what if you were rich? Easy buy your way out. Nobles paid blood prices instead of serving time. Murder someone, pay a fine, insult the church, donate a window, accidentally burn down a village, blame it on the wind and fund a statue. Wealth didn't just protect you, it rewrote the law in your favour. Gold was the best legal defence. Clergy had a loophole too. It was called benefit of clergy. If you could read Latin, you were tried in a church court. These courts were lenient, slow, and heavily biased toward robes. You could commit murder, mumble a psalm, and walk free. As a result, even criminals started memorising verses just in case. Medieval life tip: always carry a Bible and a deadpan expression. Disputes with locals, avoid them. Disrespect a merchant, get stabbed in the kneecap, insult someone's cow, you've triggered a blood feud, and if you made the mistake of flirting with the wrong person, hope you enjoy duels, rocks through windows, or a dramatic poisoning scene involving bad wine and several confused goats. And just when you think it can't get worse, tax collectors, these guys made bandits look charming. They'd show up demanding tolls, tariffs, or vague fees like livestock silence tax or sunshine levy. If you couldn't pay, they took your goods, or your cart, or your pants. Some even travelled with guards, ensuring that your compliance came with bruises. Still some travellers prepared. They hired guides, bribed local officials, or travelled with forged papers. Others joined merchant caravans, safety in numbers and receipts. But even those weren't immune. One wrong word, one spilled ale, and suddenly your name was on a list next to heretics and loud cheese vendors. Justice wasn't blind, it was drunk, sleepy, and in debt to a guy named Geoffrey. You didn't seek fairness, you sought survival. You avoided conflict, kept your head down, paid whatever was demanded, and prayed that your face didn't accidentally offend someone in charge of sharpened things. So no medieval travel wasn't just dangerous because of wolves or weather. It was dangerous because laws weren't protections, they were weapons. And if you weren't born rich, holy, or invisible, every step into a new town was a legal dice roll. The sword kept you alive. The lawyer, if you could find one, might keep your head on. So you've sinned. Who hasn't? You cheated on your fast swore at a monk, or maybe murdered someone over a particularly nice goat. But fear not, there's a solution. Strap on your most uncomfortable sandals, grab a sack of breadcrumbs, and start walking to some holy site 5 countries away, that's right. It's pilgrimage time, baby. Medieval forgiveness came with blisters. Pilgrimages were the Middle Ages version of spiritual tourism with none of the luxury and all of the tetanus. You weren't going for fun. You were going to suffer loudly, publicly, and ideally barefoot. The more miserable you looked, the more your neighbours thought, "Wow, what a holy guy." Bonus points if you limped home with a disease that rhymed with divine judgment. There were hundreds of destinations: Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, Jerusalem, each promising healing, redemption, and maybe a fragment of someone's elbow bone in a box. These relics were like medieval Yelp reviews. Cured my syphilis, raised my child, smelled amazing. But behind every sacred shrine was a trail paved with mud, crime hunger, and the occasional corpse with a rosary still clutched in hand. Let's talk preparation, or the lack thereof. Most pilgrims packed like overconfident teenagers on their first camping trip. A bit of bread, a water skin and faith, maybe a spoon. Clothes, 1 set. Soap. Don't be ridiculous. Hygiene was considered suspicious. If you smelled too clean, people assumed you were a demon or worse, a Frenchman pretending to be English. Walking long distances in medieval Europe meant encountering every flavour of terrible bandits, wolves, plague, famine and rain that felt like God flicking your ear for 40 days straight. There were no maps, just rough rumours like "follow the stars" or "take the path where 3 cows were once seen." Pilgrims relied on strangers' signs and their own bad decisions to navigate. Inns along pilgrimage routes were packed, overpriced, and slightly less sanitary than a battlefield latrine. Rooms were shared with 20 other snoring sinners. Food was sparse, beds were concepts. If you were lucky, you found a monastery that gave you soup and a bucket to die in. If you were unlucky, you got soup that made you die and no bucket. And don't assume you were alone. Pilgrimages were so popular they were medieval traffic jams. Thousands of peasants, merchants, nobles, criminals in disguise, and actual holy people all stomping in the same direction. You'd travel for weeks beside people with names like Oswin the Flatulent or Agnes who sneezes too much. By the end you loved them or you'd buried them. But let's not forget why people went. Some sought healing, others sought penance. Many were ordered by the church as punishment. You stabbed your neighbour with a pitchfork, walk to Rome and think about what you've done. It was less about redemption and more about exhausting you into compliance. Jerusalem was the dream destination for the truly committed or the completely unhinged. It took months, required sea travel, aka floating plague carts, and often ended with pirates or death by sunstroke. If you made it, you earned bragging rights, some new scars, and possibly leprosy. Back home, people would treat you like a saint until you coughed. And of course, pilgrims wore distinctive badges, little tin pins shaped like shells, swords, or holy toenails. These weren't fashion statements. They were proof you'd walk the walk. They also marked you as a target for every scam artist, pickpocket, or excommunicated monk, looking to sell you fake relics like genuine tears of St. Kevin. Miracles were expected. Not guaranteed, mind you, but expected. People drag their dying relatives hundreds of miles hoping a touch of a relic would cure gout blindness or demonic possession. Sometimes it worked through faith, placebo, or coincidence. Sometimes it didn't, and the relative died spectacularly in the middle of Mass, which frankly made for an unforgettable service. There was also a certain competitive holiness. The more grueling your journey, the holier you were. Some people crawled, others whipped themselves, some walked naked, chanting prayers and collecting mosquito bites. If Instagram existed back then, pilgrimages would have been a swampy influencer nightmare. Day 42, my feet are rotting, but I saw a statue of the Virgin Mary that looked mildly impressed. Speaking of feet, let's talk blisters. Pilgrims walked in sandals or worse barefoot. Trails were not kind. Rocks, mud ice and medieval glass, which was basically just regret, shredded your souls. There were no podiatrists, no band-aids, just prayer and socks made of hair. Feet became open-air confessionals for every bad choice you'd ever made. Despite the suffering, people found community. Songs were sung, stories shared, bread passed around. Even the most cynical pilgrim might feel a flicker of spiritual warmth, either from shared faith or from standing too close to the guy on fire after lighting his beard with a candle at Vespers. Mistakes were made. Some pilgrims wrote journals, or dictated them to monks because literacy wasn't exactly widespread. These journals are hilarious and sad, full of misspellings, complaints, divine sightings and entries like Day 19. Jeffrey tried to eat a lizard. We let him. They reveal the human side of faith, confused, itchy, but persistent. And not all pilgrims were poor. Nobles went too. They travelled with entourages, wagons, and absurd expectations. Where's the goose-feather mattress? Why does this monastery smell like people? They were often robbed or mocked by peasants for being too soft. In pilgrimage terms, the rich walked 10% of the journey and talked about it 100% of the time. Let's not pretend it was all innocent. Pilgrimages were also cover for espionage, theft, and adultery. Honey, I'm going to see St. Thomas Becket was often code for I'm fleeing my debts, and or sleeping with the stable boy. Everyone knew. No one cared. As long as you returned with a shell and a story, you were absolved by public opinion. Eventually you reached the shrine. You knelt. You wept. You touched a relic so old it looked like beef jerky wrapped in silk. You lit a candle. You thanked God's saints and your remaining toes. Then you began the long walk home, wondering if holiness was worth the rash on your thigh that now had its own personality. Still, pilgrimages mattered. They brought people together across class lines. They created trade routes, inspired poetry, and gave desperate souls something to hope for. Sure, it was filthy, dangerous, and wildly inefficient, but it gave the medieval world a sense of direction, literally and spiritually. So the next time your spiritual journey involves a yoga retreat and kombucha, take a moment. Imagine trudging through a thunderstorm barefoot with lice in your beard and guilt in your heart, all for a glimpse of a saint's fingernail in a golden box guarded by a monk with an eye twitch, and maybe whisper a quiet, grateful prayer to St. Modern Plumbing. Let's start with a simple survival tip: don't drink the water. Ever. In the Middle Ages, water wasn't refreshing. It was aggressively trying to kill you. If it looked clean, that just meant the bacteria were polite enough to be invisible. The more clear the stream, the faster it gave you diarrhea that could qualify as a war crime. Most rivers were open sewers. Cities and villages dumped everything into them: waste, dead animals, leftover stew, and that one guy who owed the baker money. Then they drank from the same water the next morning like it was fine wine. People would ladle out a bucket, glance at the floating crust of filth, shrug, and say, "Smells better than Thomas's breath." Well, water was slightly better, assuming it wasn't poisoned, contaminated by nearby graves, or doubling as a hiding spot for that travelling merchant who went missing last week. Wells weren't filtered. They were just deep holes filled with wishes, worms, and regret. You could throw a coin in and make a wish. Your wish not to vomit uncontrollably for 3 days. Boiling water helped, but fuel was expensive and common sense was rare. Plus, if you boiled your water, your neighbours might accuse you of being a witch. Look at her, heating water like she owns logic. Many chose to drink ale or weak beer instead, not for the taste, but because it had been boiled during brewing. In medieval terms, beer was medicine. By that logic, most peasants were on a liquid antibiotic diet. But let's not stop with water. Let's talk air. You know, the stuff you breathe and assume is neutral. Not in the Middle Ages. Cities reeked. The combination of manure, rotting food, open wounds, pig sweat and plague. Breath created a perfume that could stun a horse. People walked around with herbs stuffed in their nostrils, not for fashion, just to survive another market day without passing out. No one understood germs. The prevailing belief: miasma, bad air. Disease, they thought, floated invisibly through the breeze like a ghost with a grudge. If you smelled something foul, you were in danger. Hence the plague doctors with their infamous beak masks filled with spices. They weren't trying to be scary. They were trying not to smell you. Bathrooms don't even. Chamber pots were dumped out of windows onto the street below. Gardes low, people yelled in French. Translation: watch out for the pea waterfall. You could be enjoying a casual stroll when splat you received a surprise baptism in someone else's digestive consequences. Romance was difficult. Medieval streets were essentially compost piles you could walk on. Layers of mud, feces, dead rats, and broken pottery squished beneath your boots with every step. The smell rose like a warning. Children played in it. Chickens nested in it. And if you dropped your bread in it, you probably picked it up, wiped it on your shirt, and ate it anyway. Life was short. So were standards. Bathing was rare, frowned upon, and potentially sinful. The church sometimes discouraged it, fearing that clean skin led to dirty thoughts. Public bathhouses existed in some areas, but they quickly became brothels with bubbles. For the average person, a full body wash was a yearly event. You cleaned your hands, occasionally your face on special occasions, and the rest? Well, the lice could handle it. And the lice. Oh, the lice. Fleas too. Ticks. Bedbugs. Every medieval traveller was a walking ecosystem of bloodthirsty stowaways. Combs weren't for styling, they were for removing residents. People were so used to itching, they stopped mentioning it. It was like breathing or blinking, just another symptom of being alive. Diseases spread faster than gossip. The plague, dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, all waiting in every breath, every sip, every friendly handshake. How did you catch the Black Death? Oh, I borrowed a spoon. People wore religious charms, garlic necklaces, or dead birds in their clothing as protection. Spoiler, it didn't work, but it made you smell interesting. And don't forget the animals, pigs, dogs, cats, chickens. They all roamed freely inside and out. They slept beside you, ate your food, and pooped in your bed if you weren't careful. You could wake up, roll over, and find a goat chewing your hair. The concept of indoors didn't mean clean, it just meant you were sharing your lice with fewer crows. Even the rich weren't immune. Castles had guardrobes, basically toilets that emptied into the moat. That same moat was sometimes used as a water source. Knights literally drank their own waste, then rode into battle, wondering why their stomachs made noises like angry ghosts. Nobility didn't mean immunity, it just meant dying in a larger, more decorative room. Breathing was hazardous. Living near tanners, butchers, or anyone with a job that involved rotting meat meant the air carried particles of horror. Blacksmiths spewed smoke, dyers dumped chemicals, glue makers boiled hooves. If your town had tradespeople, it also had industrial-strength lung rot free with every breath. People burned incense in churches not just for holiness, but to not smell the congregation. Mass was packed. People hadn't bathed. The air was thick with prayers, flatulence, and contagious wheezing. You didn't leave church feeling enlightened. You left wondering if eternal damnation came with fresh air. And when plagues hit, things got worse. The smell of the dying, the pyres of the dead, the infected pustules leaking into streets. It was a sensory apocalypse. The air felt heavy, damp, and judgmental. People lit fires to purify the air. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just made the town smell like barbecued regret. There were no tissues, no soap as we know it, no antiseptics. If you sneezed, congratulations, you just spread the flu to everyone within 10 feet and ensured someone's grandmother wouldn't make it to winter. Even coughing in public could get you thrown out of town or accused of sorcery. Witch. No, I just have asthma. Too bad. Let's talk water again, specifically holy water, theoretically blessed and safe. But guess what? It sat in open fonts, stagnant, touched by hundreds of fingers, and occasionally used to rinse out someone's wound. You might baptize your child in it and then wonder why they developed 6 rashes and a medieval attitude. Faith didn't kill bacteria, it just gave them more interesting places to live. And still, people drank it. They had no choice. Ale and wine were expensive, milk spoiled fast, rainwater wasn't always catchable, so they filled their cups from whatever wasn't visibly moving and hoped. Some survived, some didn't. Some evolved stomachs that could digest pebbles and still complain. So next time you sip from a cold-filtered bottle of mineral water, think of the medieval peasant ladling a chunky broth from a stream full of leeches and wondering if that floating thing used to be a dog. Think of the cities drowning in their own waste, the air so thick with filth that birds flew upside down to escape it. And then take a long, clean breath. Inhale gratitude. Exhale plague. Ever dreamt of being extorted by a man in tights wielding a rusty halberd? Welcome to medieval customs and toll stations where your wallet, your patience, and occasionally your life were all fair game. Picture a random wooden shack on a muddy road, manned by someone who smells like goat cheese and authority. That's your toll booth, and if you didn't pay, let's just say they weren't handing out polite invoices. Tolls in the Middle Ages weren't standardized. You paid based on how much you looked like you could afford. Rich merchant triple toll. Peasant with a cart of turnips still got to pay. Even monks weren't safe unless they greased the right palm. And sometimes the palm came with a dagger attached. These toll collectors were often local lords, or more accurately local thugs with titles. They set up shop at river crossings, mountain passes, or anywhere inconvenient. Then they declared, "This bridge is mine." Why? Because they had soldiers, and you had knees you wanted unbroken. That was medieval legality. What counted as a tollable good? Oh, just about everything. Grain salt fish cloth your dignity. If you were breathing and carrying something, they wanted a piece of it. Some even charged based on the number of wheels on your cart. 4 wheels, double the price. Should have invested in a wheelbarrow. And you thought modern bureaucracy was bad. Medieval travellers faced a paperwork nightmare, only the paper was verbal. The stamps were fists and the receipts were, you still have your head. Negotiating tolls was like haggling at sword point. Fail to agree, and you might wake up on the wrong end of a lance. If you were lucky, tolls were just expensive. If not, they turned violent. Disputes could lead to duels, fines, or being locked in a dungeon with yesterday's porridge. And heaven forbid you forgot your safe conduct papers because suddenly you were a trespasser, smuggler, and possible spy. All at once. Speaking of safe conducts, they were basically medieval hall passes. Issued by nobles or kings, they were supposed to protect travellers. In practice, they were ignored as often as they were honoured. Oh, you have a scroll with the king's seal. How adorable. Pay up, or we torch your cart. Now let's talk bridges. Their tolls were legendary. Want to cross, that'll be 2 silver coins. Have a donkey extra charge. Want the donkey to survive the crossing. That's another fee. Some bridges charge just to let you look at the water. And don't even ask about boat ferries. Rivers were prime toll zones. No bridge great use a ferry. Owned by a local lord. He'll charge by the sack, the sheep and the prayer. Want a smooth crossing. Better say your Hail Marys and pay me. If you refuse, they might just cut the rope halfway through the river. Oh, and multiple tolls weren't uncommon. 1 toll per village. Another for crossing a field. Yet another for entering a forest, because apparently trees charged rent now. It was like playing a medieval version of Monopoly, where every square took your gold and offered 0 hotels. Foreign merchants had it worse. Locals loved milking outsiders. Wrong accent, higher toll. Wrong religion, even higher. From a rival town, prepare to sell your boots just to pass. And if you were Jewish, congratulations, you got a bonus toll called because we can. Sometimes tolls were collected by monasteries. Sounds peaceful, right? Until you realise Brother Benedict was armed, annoyed and running a racket. Monasteries owned land, and land meant roads. Roads meant tolls. Suddenly that jolly monk with a prayer book was also your financial nemesis. There were also gate tolls in cities. You wanted to enter a town, that's a toll. You wanted to leave, another toll. You sneezed near the gate toll. Guards at these gates had the moral compass of raccoons. Their job was less about law, and more about grabbing shiny things from strangers. The term for these taxes was octroi, a fancy word for payers or get stabbed. They claimed it funded public services. What services, you ask? Good question. Roads were muddy, guards were drunk, and plague pits overflowed. But hey, at least the Lord's banquet was top tier. Then there were mirage tolls supposedly to build walls. You'd think paying for city walls meant safety. Nope. You paid mirage and then still got mugged 5 feet from the gate. Because while the wall was tall, the guards were asleep. Or busy collecting more tolls. Not all tolls were money-based. Some places accepted chickens, others wanted grain. One village demanded that travellers perform a dance. That's right, you had to do a medieval jig or get fined. Nothing says robbery like forced interpretive dance on a dirt road. In some regions, women weren't charged tolls. Sound progressive. Not so fast. The toll collectors often demanded favours instead, and by favours we mean the gross kind. Travel for medieval women wasn't just dangerous, it was grotesquely transactional. Chivalry meet extortion. And let's not forget fake tolls. Bandits dressed as guards. Guards who were basically bandits. You'd pay them thinking it was official, only to be robbed again a mile down the road by the real thugs. Or worse, by the same ones who just changed hats. Travelling in a caravan helped, but only a little. Larger groups drew more attention and more tolls. Some toll booths charged per person, per animal, per breath. Medieval customs agents made airport security look like a massage parlour. At least TSA doesn't have crossbows. So what happened if you refused to pay? Best case, your goods were confiscated. Worst case, your kneecaps were restructured. Some towns posted signs, no toll, no entry, no mercy. Subtlety wasn't the strong suit of medieval finance. You might wonder, where did all that toll money go into infrastructure? It mostly went into the pockets of nobles, bishops, and corrupt mayors. Roads remained trash, bridges collapsed, and yet next year the toll went up. The medieval version of inflation, more pain for less road. Some savvy travellers tried to cheat the system. Smuggling disguises fake documents. One merchant dressed as a leper just to avoid gate fees. It worked, until he got quarantined. He paid 0 tolls, but spent 2 weeks next to an actual leper named Carl. Worth it debatable. The cherry on top tolls often changed daily. Rainy day, double toll. Festival nearby, triple toll. Random Tuesday surprise toll. You never knew what you'd be charged, just that you would be charged. Medieval travel was less about distance, and more about surviving bureaucracy by blade. So next time you whine about airline baggage fees, remember this: at least nobody's waving a spear in your face while demanding a chicken and a poem. Medieval tolls weren't just annoying, they were terrifying, and they proved one timeless truth: where there's a road, there's a racket. If you thought traffic was bad, try medieval warfare. There were no warning signs, no traffic updates, and certainly no cute animated maps with arrows showing you where the battle was. Just a quiet road 1 minute, and the next, flaming arrows and someone yelling in Norman French about your mother. Wars weren't reserved for grand fields or fortresses. They happened wherever 2 feuding lords decided to play testosterone chess with real swords. Most medieval travellers had no idea a war had even started until it was quite literally upon them, like, why are those armoured guys charging at me with pointy sticks? Level of surprise. Information moved slower than a monk's vow of silence. By the time you heard there was a conflict near the town ahead, you were already knee-deep in mud arrows and dying poetry majors with swords. You couldn't Google safest detour from plague-ridden siege unless your scribe was really fast and your pigeon had excellent cardio. There were no neutral zones. Every inch of land belonged to someone who hated someone else. And they all had cousins. Nobles weren't just fighting over kingdoms, they'd brawl over who insulted whose helmet. You innocent traveller just happened to be standing on disputed territory, which in medieval terms meant great spot for a surprise ambush. 1 minute you're enjoying a stale onion pie, the next you're ducking under a trebuchet fire. And don't think flying a flag helped. Merchants tried all sorts of tricks to avoid becoming battlefield collateral hiring guards, bribing local knights, even wearing religious symbols. But once the swords were swinging, nobody was checking your credentials. Soldiers saw you saw bags and assumed loot, or worse, assumed you were a spy because you knew how to read. That's right, literacy was suspicious. Talk about getting stabbed for your education. Even if you weren't killed, you could be recruited. That's the polite term. More accurately, pressed into service, handed a stick and told to march in a direction full of pointy metal. Refusing often resulted in your face meeting the wrong end of a mace. That's assuming they didn't just strip you of everything, say thanks for your contribution to the war effort, and leave you to wander pantsless across a battlefield like a confused goat. If you were lucky, you might get captured. Yes, lucky. Because being captured meant you were worth ransoming. Nobles paid for each other's release like trading cards. But if you were a peasant traveller, no one paid for you. Your ransom note would get laughed at, then turned into toilet paper. You were either forced into hard labour or just not seen again. Medieval dungeons didn't have Yelp ratings, but if they did, negative stars and a plague warning. Now consider logistics. You're walking along a road, well, a muddy suggestion of one, and see a distant town. Looks peaceful. Maybe a market day. But then you spot smoke. Not chimney smoke. Not bread smoke. The someone sacking the village kind. Do you approach, turn back? Either way you lose, head forward and you might walk into a siege. Retreat, and you'll meet the guys who just sacked it. That's not a sandwich, it's a panic attack on rye. Sieges weren't quick affairs. Cities could be surrounded for months, even years. Starvation disease and the occasional flaming cow were standard. If you happen to be inside, congratulations, you're now stuck with 100 other terrified people eating rats and pretending the walls won't crumble. Outside, you're fair game for both sides, and sometimes even the mercenaries who switch sides more often than they change socks. Speaking of mercenaries, these guys weren't loyal soldiers. They fought for the highest bidder and looted as part of the job description. Some medieval travellers kept coins hidden in their shoes or sewed into clothing. Why? Because you never knew when you'd meet a man in armour who believed your soul and your purse belonged to him equally. These weren't honourable knights. They were murderers with paperwork. And then there were peasant uprisings, not official wars per se, but angry mobs with pitchforks and nothing to lose. Land taxes too high, peasants revolt. Lords retaliate. Guess who gets trampled in the crossfire? That's right, the guy from out of town looking for a warm meal. Locals would turn on you faster than a drunk monk if they thought you were a tax collector in disguise. Spoiler, everyone hated tax collectors. Even tax collectors hated being tax collectors. Religious wars made things even worse. Pilgrims were attacked, temples desecrated, and entire regions became no-go zones, unless you wanted to be boiled for heresy. Did you say the wrong prayer? Dress like the wrong sect? Use your left hand too much? Congratulations, you're now a blasphemer, and may be burned at the stake or at least politely flogged. Travelling with a Bible didn't help. Everyone thought you had the wrong version. And don't get smug thinking Europe was the only blood-soaked mess. The Crusades turned travel into a multi-regional death lottery. Crossing borders meant adapting to a dozen different customs, each enforced by people with sharp weapons and short tempers. The wrong word in Arabic, Latin or Greek could mean please show me to the inn, or stab me in the throat, I'm a heretic. Language learning was a survival skill like dodging arrows and feigning religious neutrality. The concept of a safe passage did exist, on parchment. Kings issued travellers' letters of protection complete with fancy wax seals and grand signatures, but reality. Those letters were good kindling. Most highway patrols were illiterate or just didn't care. You'd show them the document and they'd respond with neat before relieving you of your boots, horse and dignity. At best, it got you a slower mugging. And it wasn't just people. Armies destroyed the roads too. Fields were burned, bridges torn down, villages turned into ashtrays. You couldn't even rely on nature. Rivers were often flooded on purpose as defence mechanisms, turning your peaceful riverside stroll into a mucky drowning hazard. One misstep and you'd be memorialised as that guy who didn't read the mud. Trade routes, please. Those were war zones with price tags. If you were lucky enough to pass through, you paid 100 tolls to 100 lords, who all believed they owned the same road. Refusing to pay meant your wagon got burned, and you were detained for questioning, which was a polite way of saying tortured until someone changed their mind. You didn't need a wallet, you needed bribes luck, and a complete disregard for personal safety. Fun fact, some travellers pretended to be jesters. Why? Because people were less likely to stab you if they thought you were stupid. Humour was your armour. A funny hat and a dumb dance sometimes saved lives. That's how bad things were. It was safer to act like a fool than admit you could write your name or speak in full sentences. Medieval strategy, clown or corpse. Choose wisely. And once the war ended, great news, you were still screwed. Armies left behind disease, famine and moral bankruptcy. Survivors were often conscripted to rebuild the places they'd just watched burn. And if you lingered too long in one town, you were treated like a looter or worse, a spy. People weren't looking for friends, they were looking for someone to blame, and travellers made excellent scapegoats. The bottom line: in the Middle Ages, oops, I stepped in a war wasn't a punchline, it was a weekly occurrence. Travel wasn't just dangerous, it was a test of luck ignorance, and how well you could run in chainmail. So next time your flight gets delayed, remember, at least no one's accusing you of witchcraft or marching you into a sword fight because your shoes looked foreign. Ah, the church in the Middle Ages, a place of comfort, right? Think again. Sure, they had candlelight choirs and the occasional miracle, but they also had excommunications, inquisitions, and relics so fake, Even a modern souvenir shop would blush. If you were travelling and desperate, you might crawl to a monastery and beg for food. But if you happened to sneeze wrong during Mass, they might decide you were possessed by a demon, or worse, by skepticism. Let's say you wandered into a new town hoping to rest and maybe confess that one time you stole a sausage. What you'd find was often a stone cathedral, ominously quiet, with a priest who may or may not have bathed this season. And while you might expect a warm welcome, you were just as likely to be asked for your pilgrimage license, which didn't exist, but that didn't stop anyone from pretending it did. They'd offer you absolution for a modest fee. And by modest, we mean the price of your horse and dignity. Now, if you were lucky, you might encounter a kind abbot who offered you stale bread and a spot in the barn. But if you looked even remotely sick, blame the road dust or fleas, they'd start reciting Latin and waving incense like it was a medieval exorcism. One cough could brand you as cursed. 2 coughs. Now you're a witch and someone's fetching the dunking chair. The church was not just a place of worship. It was a travel checkpoint, a courtroom, and occasionally a theatre. Ever seen a morality play? Imagine live medieval theatre sponsored by guilt. Travelling players would reenact scenes of hell, so vivid kids would scream and adults would drop coins to avoid becoming the next act. And yes, that coin collection went straight into funding more fear. The good news, some monks were genuinely trying to help. They kept medical herbs, offered shelter, and could read Latin. The bad news, most of their knowledge came from Galen, a man who thought bloodletting cured headaches, and that women's wombs wandered around the body like lost puppies. So if you showed signs of excess melancholy, congratulations, you got bled, prayed over, and then sent into the woods with a cross and a pat on the back. And don't even get started on relics. If you thought timeshares were sketchy, imagine buying a splinter of the true cross in every town. That's right, there were reportedly enough pieces of the cross to build Noah's Ark twice. And if you dared question it, heretic. And remember, medieval heretics didn't get unfollowed, they got firewood stacked around them. Pilgrimage routes were no safer either. You'd think walking to a holy site would give you a pass from danger. But you still had bandits, wild dogs, and occasionally local clergy charging you to look at a shin bone they swore belonged to St. Peter. And don't ask for proof, faith is the receipt and returns not accepted. Sometimes the church helped travellers for a price. There were indulgences which were basically spiritual coupons. Commit a sin by a pardon, steal a chicken that'll be a silver coin, murder someone on the road. Slightly more, as long as you paid, heaven was back on the menu. If not, or better start digging your own eternal pit stop. Confessionals were the original medieval Yelp. People lined up to unload sins like emotional hoarders, and priests were the original therapists, except they didn't offer coping mechanisms. They offered penance. Walk barefoot for 10 miles, fast for a week, flagellate yourself while singing psalms, basically CrossFit for the soul. Of course, if you crossed the wrong bishop, you might end up in ecclesiastical court. Sounds holy, right? Nope. It was like Judge Judy with a crucifix. Your trial could involve dunking bleeding, or the infamous trial by hot iron. Yes, if your hand didn't burn too badly, you were innocent. And if it did, clearly God was punishing you. Case closed. Women travellers had it worse shocking, I know. A lone woman walking into a monastery suspicious. She's probably a temptress, or worse, an herbalist. Better tie her up and see if she floats, because nothing says faith like fearing half the population and burning the other half for growing lavender. The church also ran hospices for travellers. Sounds lovely, except hospice could mean anything from a cosy room to a rat-infested cellar with a monk chanting psalms at your bed while you coughed up your soul. If you lived, it was a miracle. If you died, even better, a blessed death. All part of the service. The clergy also served as record keepers, so every time you passed a town, your name might be scribbled in a dusty book, unless you were poor, foreign or suspicious, in which case the entry read vagrant and someone might come knocking with shackles. Literacy was power, and they had the monopoly. Now let's talk hexes. Was the church into magic officially? No. unofficially, let's just say if a monk prayed over your illness and you died anyway, it was God's will. But if you lived, it was definitely his blessing. Also, sometimes they buried statues upside down to stop floods. Totally not superstition, just sacred landscaping. And if you really got unlucky, you might stumble upon a local inquisition. Think of it as medieval HR, but instead of getting fired, you got burned. They asked questions no one could answer right. Do you consort with demons? No, liar. Yes. Witch. You couldn't win. And the more you talked, the more rope they fetched. Still many travellers took solace in chapels and roadside crosses. After all, a prayer was cheaper than a sword, and sometimes all you had left. But even these humble moments could be interrupted. Picture kneeling by a shrine, whispering a prayer, and getting pickpocketed by a fake pilgrim with a fake limp and a real knife. And let's not forget the flagellants. Travelling bands of shirtless people whipping themselves to appease God. Yes, that was a thing. They'd parade into town, chant spooky Latin, bleed all over the cobblestones, and leave everyone terrified and confused. Meanwhile, actual bandits watched and wondered why they even tried. At its best, the church was a shelter. At its worst, it was a medieval DMV run by ghosts and guilt. It offered sanctuary, but only if you didn't sneeze too loud, look too foreign, or ask too many questions. For a traveller, it was one of the most important stops, and one of the most unpredictable. So next time you pass a church on your travels and think, how peaceful, just remember in 1347 it might have saved your soul, cursed your crops, or set your beard on fire. All in a day's work for the holiest bureaucracy ever to tax your sin. The next time someone tells you to go take a walk in the woods, just remember in the Middle Ages that was code for go die. Forests back then weren't Pinterest retreats with hammocks and chai lattes. They were murder zones blessed with bandits, wolves, and the occasional wandering corpse. If you wandered in alone, odds were 50-50 you'd wander back out with all your limbs. And if you did survive, congratulations, you probably still caught lice. Travellers had a healthy fear of trees and not for allergy reasons. The moment you stepped under the forest canopy, you entered a zone without witnesses' laws or functioning moral compasses. This made it the medieval version of a free trial for death. Outlaws camped under trees like squirrels, only with knives and parental abandonment issues. They didn't ask for your name, just your purse, your horse, and ideally your blood. Kings tried to legislate forest safety the way toddlers try to reason with gravity. Royal decrees were posted, patrols were sent, and immediately ambushed. Even professional soldiers hesitated before riding through the more infamous groves. One 14th century bishop famously refused to travel through Sherwood Forest, not because of Robin Hood, he just didn't want to be mugged by someone named Gutstab the Silent. Forests were also prime dumping grounds. Need to hide a body, trees don't ask questions. There's a reason medieval ballads mention so many dark woods and silent glades, because someone definitely got murdered there last Tuesday. The rotting logs weren't just scenery, they were crime scene furniture. Imagine hiking while casually stepping over ribs. Fun times. And it wasn't just bandits. Wolves, real honest-to-God wolves, roamed in packs because humans hadn't yet invented environmental devastation. A starving wolf doesn't care about your holy pilgrimage. It cares about the salt content in your legs. Villagers near forests used to lock their doors by sundown not to avoid demons, but to avoid becoming a protein snack. Let's not forget the supernatural angle. Medieval folks were delightfully unhinged when it came to forest lore. Every tree had a ghost, every clearing had a witch, and every crow was basically Satan's AirPods. So even if you weren't stabbed or eaten, there was still the off chance you'd be cursed into a frog for trespassing on Druid TikTok land. Churches didn't help either. Instead of discouraging people from murdering in forests, they just built more roadside shrines. For prayers after you've been robbed. It's like putting a Band-Aid stand next to a minefield. One popular traveller's prayer from the 13th century literally reads, "Deliver me from wolves and thieves." That's not hyperbole. That's a packing list. And don't think travelling in groups guaranteed safety. Bandits didn't care if you had company, they cared if you had coins. Some gangs were so organised they had their own accounting systems. Imagine being mugged by someone who itemises your belongings before gutting you. 1 belt, 2 shoes, 3 screams. Very professional. Some forests were so bad they had names like Death Hollow or Thieves' Wood. Not poetic names, actual warning labels. Think of it as medieval Yelp, except instead of 1-star reviews, it was 3 missing limbs. And yet peasants still had to travel through them because guess what? The toll roads were even worse. It wasn't unusual for bodies to stay where they fell. Burial crews didn't stroll forest trails with shovels. That meant travellers occasionally encountered what historians call bone piles. Imagine walking, hearing a crunch, and realising that wasn't a stick. Your travel companion mutters, "That's unlucky," and suddenly the forest feels a lot colder. Want to know what the real horror movie was? Twilight in a medieval forest. That's when the shadows grew teeth. Visibility dropped, you might walk into a tree and never walk out. Campfires helped, but they also acted like beacons to every starving beast and sociopath within 5 miles. You weren't just lighting a fire, you were lighting a mug me sign. Guides existed, but they were a gamble. Some were trustworthy, some led you straight into ambushes for a cut of the loot, and some were so drunk on mead they couldn't tell north from their own elbow. But desperate travellers still hired them because going alone was like painting "Kill Me Slowly" on your forehead. And let's not forget about the weather. Forests trapped moisture like a sadistic sponge. Rain meant mud, mud meant slipping. Slipping meant injuries, and injuries meant you bled out next to a mossy stump, while squirrels judged your dying noises. Forest air was cold, wet, and vaguely haunted. Think nature's way of saying, you shouldn't be here. There were no trail markers, no warning signs, and no rescue services. If you screamed in a medieval forest, chances are the only answer you'd get was from something planning to eat you. It's not dramatic, it's Tuesday. Travellers often left behind farewell letters in case they didn't make it. That's not romance, that's statistics. Sometimes nobles had the luxury of an armed escort. But unless your last name was Plantagenet, your best defence was prayer and a sharp stick. People carried daggers not to fight, but to maybe die with dignity. Or more realistically, to offer the bandit and say, "Take this too, just please leave my boots." By the 15th century, some forests had such reputations that maps started labelling them with skulls. Literal skulls. Here be death wasn't metaphorical, it was cartographic honesty. And if you thought of taking a shortcut, good luck explaining to your ghost why convenience was worth dying for. Even postal messengers feared the trees. There are records of royal letters delayed for weeks because the forest was feeling stabby. That's not a joke. That's court documentation. Imagine risking your life to deliver a message that just says "King wants more cheese." Eventually, as roads improved and policing existed outside theory, forest travel became slightly less suicidal. But during the bulk of the Middle Ages, road trip was code for slow descent into a leafy hellscape. We complain about potholes. They complained about murder. So the next time your GPS reroutes you through a wooded detour, just be grateful you're not carrying gold, wearing wool, and hoping the crows aren't snitches. Because in medieval times, forests didn't offer peace, they offered a punchline, and the punch was usually fatal. You'd think a horse would be your best friend on a medieval journey. Loyal, noble, maybe even heroic if you watch too many movies. Reality check horses in the Middle Ages were less black beauty and more angry beast, with back pain and an attitude problem. They weren't groomed, they weren't happy. And if they threw you off a cliff because your saddle smelled funny, well, tough luck. You were basically hitching a ride on a sentient muscle machine that hated everyone. Let's start with the obvious. Not everyone got a horse. Horses were expensive. So expensive, in fact, that many peasants could barely afford shoes, let alone a hooved death trap. If you had one, congrats, you were either a knight, a merchant with coin to spare, or a monk who swindled a noble's donation. And if your horse broke a leg or just died mid-journey, there were no refunds. Only tears, prayers, and a very long walk home. But let's say you were lucky enough to own a horse. Was it comfortable? Absolutely not. Saddles back then were wooden. as in solid slabs of agony strapped to a twitchy animal. No padding, no ergonomic design, just a medieval chiropractor's dream come true. After 2 days in that thing, your butt wasn't sore, it was questioning the meaning of existence. Oh, and good luck steering the damn thing. Reins were more like suggestions. If your horse decided it didn't like the smell of a nearby stream or spotted a squirrel and had an existential crisis, there went your plans. You could be headed for a monastery and suddenly find yourself in a swamp full of frogs and regret. Some horses would buck just for fun, some would bite. All had the personality of a caffeinated gremlin. Feeding them was another medieval nightmare. No pre-packaged oats, no sweet hay. Just whatever sad excuse for grass you could find by the roadside, half of which was probably covered in plague rat pee. Horses needed space to graze water to drink and shelter at night, which means you either slept beside them or paid through the nose at an inn that charged extra because Sir Lancelot pooped in the hallway. And if your horse got sick, medieval vet care was just one step above sorcery. They believed in treatments like bleeding the animal to rebalance its humours or rubbing burnt hair on its hooves. Spoiler alert, none of that worked. If your horse had colic, it was basically a death sentence. And guess who got to carry your luggage after that? That's right, you. Now imagine travelling in winter. Horses didn't come with snow tyres. Ice made them nervous. Wet mud made them angry. And cold wind turned them into biting, neighing mood machines. If you slipped and fell, they might trample you on the way out of their own panic. Some horses even refused to move in bad weather, just stood there, like four-legged protesters against poor life decisions. And don't assume your horse liked you. Bonding wasn't a thing. You weren't whispering to them like some bearded fantasy hero. Most travellers treated their horses like living carts, and horses being the spiteful geniuses they are remembered. If you fed them poorly, or whipped too hard, they'd step on your foot, kick your chest, or dump you in a ditch the moment your back was turned. Karma had hooves. Bandits also loved horses, yours to be specific. Horse theft was basically the medieval version of Grand Theft Auto, and there were no car alarms, no insurance. If someone ran off with your ride, the best you could do was scream and chase them on foot, sobbing while they vanished into the horizon with your transport, your bags, and your last ounce of dignity. Even if you made it safely to your destination, you couldn't exactly park your horse. Towns had filthy, overcrowded stables, and you had to bribe some teenage stable boy not to sell your horse to the next stranger with coin. Lose your horse, and your return trip was about as promising as an unsalted turnip. Slow, sad, soul-crushing. Also, let's talk smells. Horses stank, and medieval people weren't showering either. Combine sweat, manure, rotting saddlecloths and wet fur, and you've got yourself a travelling odour bomb. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a health hazard. There are historical accounts of people fainting from the stink of packed horse caravans in summer. You could die from a sneeze. Now let's say you're on a pilgrimage. Long journey, rough terrain, emotional baggage. Maybe you're trying to atone for that one time you stole your cousin's goat. You think your horse cares? No. It's too busy trying to throw you off because it stepped on a pine cone. Pilgrims were constantly losing their mounts. Lost my horse to piety, they'd say, meaning it wandered off while they prayed too long. And don't get me started on horse armour. Yes, knights deck their horses out in plate metal. It looked cool, but added about 200 pounds of shear. Please end my suffering. The horses hated it. They sweated. They collapsed. Some even refused to move. You think traffic is bad now. Try 6 armoured horses collapsing in a narrow road while the priest behind you screams about divine punishment. Speaking of traffic, road rage was real. Horses biting other horses. Riders cursing each other in Latin. Some travellers even carried spiked stirrups just in case a stranger's horse got too close. There were no traffic laws, no right of way. Just hoof hoof, yell, trample. If you survived a long journey without at least one horse-related injury, you were either a saint or lying. Now, if you lost your horse mid-journey, sometimes you could rent another one, which sounds helpful until you realise the horse was probably stolen from someone else the day before. You'd get attached, name it, share your last turnip. Then the local lord would show up, slap a fine on your face, and ride off on his horse while you stood there turnipless and stunned. Ever wonder why people travelled in groups? It wasn't for friendship, it was for horse backups. If Gerald's horse dropped dead, maybe Linda had one to share. If Linda's horse kicked a merchant, maybe Gerald could bribe the guards. It was survival through equine misery sharing. A bond forged not by love, but by saddle sores and mutual distrust of hooves. Oh, and don't forget about wild animals. Wolves, boars, bandits with animal masks. If your horse spooked and ran, you were toast. Horses didn't stick around for hugs. They fled. You were left face first in the mud, wondering why medieval travel wasn't covered in high school history class with a warning label. So next time you see a horse in a movie noble and shining in the sunlight, remember that thing probably hates you. It's cold, hungry, itchy under the saddle and one wrong move away from kicking your femur into next week. Travelling in the Middle Ages wasn't just dangerous because of humans. It was dangerous because your ride had feelings and none of them were positive. And the worst part, if your horse died on the road, you couldn't even eat it. Well, you could, but only if you wanted dysentery hallucinations or divine punishment from a passing bishop. Horse meat was taboo, so your only consolation for losing your transport was a funeral and maybe a small poem. Here lies Gerald's horse. He bit 5 people and never liked grass. Rest in manure. So yeah, your horse might hate you, and honestly, you deserve it. So you're trotting along the muddy road in your plague-era clogs, just trying to get from one rat-infested town to the next, and bam! A man with a crossbow and questionable hygiene jumps out and asks if you've been sneezing lately. Welcome to the medieval version of a health checkpoint. Except this one comes 2 weeks after the symptoms started, and the guy checking your wellness thinks leeches might cure you. Spoiler, they won't. But they will ruin your picnic. The Black Death, which sounds like a heavy metal album but was in fact much worse, killed around 50 million people in Europe. That's not a typo. And guess what made it spread faster? Yep, travel. People on foot, people on carts, people coughing on each other while waiting to bribe toll collectors. The road system in the 14th century basically turned into a plague delivery network with 0 customer service and a 100% mortality guarantee. Public health officials back then were about as effective as a bucket in a house fire. Towns would occasionally set up crude checkpoints, but their idea of screening travellers was asking, "So are you dying?" If the answer was no, you were good to go. If the answer was yes, well, you were still good to go. Just not for very long. And remember, there were no thermometers, no nasal swabs, and absolutely no understanding of germs. Instead, they had a system based on vibes. If you looked pale and a little sweaty, congrats, you were branded a walking death balloon. If you happened to be whistling and lively, they assumed the plague hadn't yet possessed your body like a demon from biblical fan fiction. Even better, there was no central health authority. Each town did its own thing. Some places would quarantine newcomers for 30 to 40 days, hence the term quarantine from the Italian quaranta giorni. Others thought you could just burn aromatic herbs and chant at the wind and voila, no more plague. It's like fighting an earthquake with a scented candle. Now let's talk about quarantine zones, because nothing screams relaxing vacation, like being locked in a tower with a bunch of sneezing strangers. If you were lucky, they gave you a straw bed and a bucket. If you were unlucky, they sealed you inside your house and painted a red cross on your door. That's not medieval hospitality. That's pre-modern horror movie logic. Merchants were especially hated. Why? Because they travelled carried cloth, which fleas loved, and had more money than commoners. So if you were a travelling merchant, people assumed you were the plague's personal Uber driver. In fact, some towns straight up banned all incoming merchants, which was great for public health, but terrible for your Etsy shop of hand-painted goblets. And if you're wondering whether travellers themselves understood how plague worked, absolutely not. The best theory available was that it came from bad air or miasma. That's right. People thought the wind had turned evil, so they'd travel wearing beak masks filled with herbs like rosemary and mint, because nothing screams safety like a bird cosplay during biological warfare. Did any of it work? Not really. The plague didn't care if you wore a weird mask, prayed extra hard, or rubbed onions on your armpits. Yes, that was a thing. What it did care about was how tightly packed people were, how often they fled cities and brought the disease to rural areas, and how fleas and rats partied together like it was the end of days. Spoiler, it kind of was. Sometimes towns would erect barricades and guard the gates with armed men. Sounds organised right. Until you realise the guards were usually random locals with pitchforks and a strong dislike of foreigners. So instead of an organised disease control plan, it became a mix of xenophobia guesswork and low-budget militia vibes. And here's a fun detail, some cities didn't just block the roads. They dug trenches around the whole place to keep people out. It's like building a moat against an invisible enemy. Did it stop the disease? Nope. But it did create some nice scenic ditches, ideal for hiding in when you coughed too loudly and didn't want to get stabbed. Pilgrims didn't help either. These were people who travelled in large groups, slept in barns, swapped lice like trading cards, and believed that visiting a holy site would keep them safe. Nothing like a congested mob of the devout marching directly into cities already struggling with the apocalypse. It was the Middle Ages version of a super-spreader event, but with more chanting and less hand sanitizer. Even worse, when the plague did hit a town, panic broke out faster than the disease. People locked their doors, left family members behind, and ran for the hills. That sounds cruel, because it was. But back then, compassion took a back seat to sheer paralysing terror. Love thy neighbour, not if they're coughing. Not if. So let's say you're a traveller arriving at a town during plague season. You're hoping for a warm bed, maybe a bowl of soup. Instead, the gatekeeper eyes you like a contagious ferret. He asks where you came from, and you answer Florence. Boom. Instant quarantine. Florence was plague central. You may as well have said, I've been licking infected corpses for fun. And remember, news travelled slowly, so by the time one town heard that another was infected, it was already too late. The rats had moved on, the bodies were piling up, and all that was left was to blame God foreigners or your local cat population. Yes, really, people killed cats thinking they were agents of Satan, which ironically let the rats breed unchecked. Brilliant move, humanity. The most ironic part, roads themselves helped spread the plague faster than ever. Roman infrastructure, those famous roads built centuries earlier, were now aiding the Grim Reaper's commute. Straight paths, direct routes, no tolls too high for bacteria to pay. The Middle Ages didn't invent fast travel, but they sure gave it a head start. And while the upper class could sometimes escape to remote estates, the poor, they had two options, die in the city or die on the road. Most chose the road thinking fresh air might save them. It didn't. But hey, at least they got to die somewhere scenic. So what have we learned from all this? That in the Middle Ages your best chance of surviving a pandemic was to stay still, trust no one and hope the rats liked your neighbours better than you, and even then you were probably screwed. The concept of flattening the curve back then meant falling flat on your face in a field clutching your chest. Next time you gripe about COVID restrictions, remember this. No Zoom calls, no vaccines, and your quarantine meal was likely stale rye bread and a spoonful of fear. Now go ahead, hug your soap, bless your hand sanitizer, and be grateful you live in an era where sneezing doesn't get you exiled. Imagine buying a boat ticket where the fine print basically says, high chance of drowning, disease starvation, piracy, and or being eaten by rats. No refunds. Welcome to medieval sea travel where every journey was basically a gamble and the house always won. The ocean wasn't just a vast expanse of water, it was a death arena, and you, the traveller, were the clueless contestant. You think flight delays are bad? At least turbulence doesn't involve Viking longships boarding you and setting your eyebrows on fire. Maritime insurance back then was a prayer and a saint's bone in your pocket. Let's start with the boats themselves. These weren't the sleek romantic galleons you see in movies. Most were wooden bathtubs with sails patched up more often than a leper's tunic. The hulls leaked, the ropes snapped, the sails tore like wet parchment, and don't even get me started on the creaking. Every groan of the timber was like a whisper from Poseidon, "You're next." Navigation was part science, part superstition, and 100% vibes. If you were lucky, your captain had seen a map once. More likely, he was following a hunch in the shape of clouds. Stars were helpful unless it was cloudy, which was often. Compasses existed, but trust in them rare. Many thought they were tools of the devil. So yes, let's entrust our fate to a man with no GPS, no radar, and a deep personal beef with compasses. Then came the food. Rations is too generous a word. Think hardtack, also known as tooth destroyers, salted meat, if you could call it meat and ale, that had the consistency of soup and the hygiene of a public toilet. Meals were less about nutrition and more about survival roulette. One bite might keep you alive, another might introduce your bowels to the concept of mutiny. And speaking of bowels, seasickness was everyone's favourite pastime. Imagine 50 men vomiting simultaneously in a confined wooden space, with no proper sanitation. No wonder people believed the devil lived at sea. He probably did. In the latrine bucket, if there was one. Disease loved ships more than sailors did. Typhus, scurvy, dysentery, plague, you name it, it's stowed away for free. Quarantine. That wasn't policy. That was hindsight. The sick were often thrown overboard, which only helped if you didn't already share a hammock with them. Oh, right, hammocks. Try sleeping on damp wood next to a barrel of questionable fish. Pirates were the customer service representatives of the sea, always popping up when you least needed them. Sometimes they robbed you. Sometimes they took your ship. Sometimes they made you row. Sometimes they politely asked for your boots and then stabbed you anyway. There were codes, yes, but most were written in R and interpreted with axes. The weather was another constant enemy. Storms came without warning, waves tall as cathedrals smashed hulls like toys, and lightning seemed personally offended by sails. If you survived a storm, you got a damp cloak and lifelong trauma. That's it. No medals, no hot soup. Just wet socks and the realization that dry land was a myth. Boats were also overcrowded. Human sardines packed into a barrel of sweat and prayers. Privacy didn't exist. You did everything, eat, sleep, cry, die within arm's reach of someone else doing the same. You might get to know your crewmates too well, like how Jacob snores like a drowning goat, or how Pierre smells worse than the bilge. Then there were the rats. Not cute Disney sidekicks. These were disease-bearing, food-stealing nightmare nibblers that could outswim you. Sailors feared them almost as much as the captain. Some say rats knew when a ship was doomed. If they jumped ship, so should you. Unfortunately, they often left after nibbling your only remaining loaf of bread. Ports weren't much safer. Docking could mean extortion, quarantine, or being mistaken for an invader. Local lords taxed everything, your cargo, your crew, your size. And if the town was at war, congratulations, you just parked in a battle. Now you're a soldier. Good luck. Oh, and did I mention linguistic nightmares? Every port had a different language, currency, and set of rules. Mispronounce one word and you might accidentally sell your boat insult a bishop or propose marriage. Or all three at once. Religious sailors sometimes carried relics for protection: a saint's tooth, a splinter of the true cross, maybe a jawbone of St. Maritime. Superstition ran the ship, not logic. Women on board, bad luck. Albatross worse. Singing "It Depends," were you chanting or cursing? One wrong move and the sea gods might rearrange your bones. Shipwrecks were common, but rescue was not. If you survived, you were expected to swim, in full armour sometimes, to an island that might be inhabited by monks, or cannibals, or cannibal monks. If they were friendly, you might get soup. If not, you became the soup. Letters from sea travellers were often their last words. If you find this, I am probably fish food. Tell my goat I loved her. Families sometimes waited years for news, any news. Most gave up and assumed the worst. Often they were right. Children travelled by ship too, usually as cargo. Apprentices, orphans, or lucky heirs being shipped off to marry strangers in foreign lands. Their survival rate wasn't great, but hey, character building. If you reached adulthood, you were legally entitled to complain forever. Let's talk about merchant ships. Greedy captains overloaded them for profit. Balance optional. Safety expensive. A few extra barrels of spice could mean capsizing in a stiff breeze. It was capitalism at sea, sink or sell, and yet people still did it. Because sometimes the alternative was worse. Land roads full of bandits, forests full of wolves, and towns full of taxes. The sea with all its horror was the lesser hell. A moving coffin, yes, but at least it moved. So next time your cruise is delayed or the Wi-Fi cuts out, think of Brother John 1342, who died vomiting into a bucket while praying to St. Ignatius to stop the rats from stealing his shoes. Sea travel builds character, mostly by killing the weak. Bon voyage medieval style. Just don't forget your plague mask, anti-rat dagger, and a healthy fear of clouds. You'll need all three. Imagine this. You're a woman in the 14th century. You've got somewhere to be, maybe a pilgrimage, maybe visiting family, or maybe you just had enough of your village's turnip-based economy. Either way, you pack your things, read a satchel with a crust of bread and a stick, and you hit the road. Congratulations. You've just unlocked hard mode. Travelling as a man in the Middle Ages was a nightmare. Doing it as a woman that was basically speed-running a horror movie. First, let's talk about safety, or the lack of it. There were no police patrols, no streetlights, no cameras. If you were lucky, you'd be in a caravan of other travellers. If not, you were walking meat with a coin purse. Women travelling alone were considered suspicious at best and targets at worst. Bandits didn't exactly have a code of chivalry, and the law, The law was wherever the nearest sword pointed. But maybe you thought travelling with a group would help. In theory, yes. In practice, welcome to your new hell social judgment. You'd be questioned, ogled, and occasionally accused of being a witch. Because what woman chooses to travel alone unless she's up to sorcery? If you weren't married, people wanted to know why. If you were married, people still wanted to know why your husband let you wander. It was a game of pick your oppression. Let's say you're on a pilgrimage. Sounds holy, right? Nope. Pilgrimage routes were hotbeds of disease, bad food, worse water, and horny knights who believed every woman on the road was either a nun, a witch, or fair game. Spoiler alert. They treated all three the same. Pilgrims' inns had no female-only spaces. You'd sleep next to strangers, possibly livestock, and definitely fleas. Sex crimes weren't the exception, they were the risk of admission. Speaking of crime, did we mention the lack of legal recourse? If something bad happened to you, and let's face it, something would you could complain to the local lord or magistrate. They might laugh, or they might marry you off to your attacker to resolve the scandal. Because remember, ladies, in the Middle Ages, your purity mattered more than your trauma. Justice was basically a badly translated rumour. Clothing didn't help. A woman dressed plainly was accused of hiding something. A woman dressed finely was accused of asking for attention. A woman dressed in men's clothing, burn her. There was no winning. Even wearing trousers under your skirt for safety could lead to accusations of cross-dressing a criminal offence in some regions. Safety or salvation, pick one. And don't forget childbirth. Some women travelled while pregnant, often out of necessity. There were no travel exemptions for pregnancy, only added hazards. Roads jostled, carts lacked suspension, and inns weren't known for prenatal care. If you went into labour mid-journey, you prayed for a midwife. What you usually got was a peasant with strong thumbs and a bucket. Outcomes were medieval. Now imagine travelling after childbirth. You're healing, leaking, and possibly carrying a newborn. Breastfeeding on the side of a dusty road while someone tries to sell you blessed goat dung isn't exactly glamorous. And that baby, they're not exempt from danger. Infants were prime targets for disease abandonment, and in some cases, especially if the woman was single accusations of infanticide. Again, hard mode. And then there were the predators, not just the four-legged kind. Women had to worry about men who saw them as property soldiers, who saw them as spoils, and clergy who saw them as temptation. Confession booths weren't always places of mercy. Some priests saw travelling women as fair game for salvation through manipulation. Bless me, Father, for I've been blackmailed. Even finding a place to relieve yourself was a nightmare. Men could just wander off into a ditch. Women had to hike up 10 layers of cloth in an open field, hoping no one walked by. Public rest stops didn't exist. Privacy. What's that? And if someone saw too much skin, guess whose fault it was? Medieval victim blaming was practically a sport. Let's not forget literacy or the lack thereof. Many women couldn't read maps or signs, not because they were stupid, but because education wasn't for them. Directions were passed by word of mouth. You'd get sent toward the big tree past the sick cow, and if you misheard, enjoy the next 6 hours walking in a giant circle while hungry. Modern women complain about mansplaining. Medieval women didn't get directions, they got suspicion. Also, menstruation. Yes, let's go there. No pads, no tampons, cloth rags if you were lucky, moss if you weren't. Now try managing that on a bumpy cart ride in a forest, or next to a monastery. Bleed discreetly, or get accused of being possessed. Medieval solutions included herbal remedies and prayer. Spoiler, neither stopped the cramps. Some women disguised themselves as men to travel safely. It sometimes worked. Joan of Arc famously wore male armour. But guess what? She was burned at the stake partly for wearing trousers. That's right, pants were blasphemous. A pair of leggings could get you executed. In 1431, fabric was a felony. Today you get judged for wearing Crocs. Back then, breeches got you barbecued. Of course there were exceptional women travellers. Marjorie Kempe, the medieval travel influencer before Instagram, journeyed to Jerusalem while claiming divine visions, crying a lot, and being generally exhausting. People thought she was insane. They weren't wrong, but she got around and wrote a book about it, so hey girl power, just bring your own scribe. Foreign travel was even worse. As a woman, if you didn't speak the language, you were more vulnerable. People assumed you were a slave, a spy, or an exotic dancer, sometimes all three. Markets were dangerous, cities were overwhelming, and finding help meant trusting strangers. In other words, don't get lost, and if you do, try not to cry too loudly. Food don't count on it. Inns served stale bread and mystery meat. Women were often served last or charged more for trouble. Men could haggle, women could beg. Starving on the road wasn't just common, it was expected. Many women fasted during travel not out of religious devotion, but because there was nothing safe to eat. Fasting by famine, let's call it. And yet, they travelled. Despite the odds, despite the threats, the stink, the judgment, and the complete absence of a Yelp review system. They walked, rode, prayed, and survived. Not all of them, of course, but enough to leave their mark, sometimes in journals, sometimes in scandals, always in silence. Their stories are scattered like breadcrumbs in a storm. So next time you hop in an Uber, clutch your oat milk and whine about traffic, take a second to salute the unnamed women who walk through war zones with a baby in one arm, a bundle of herbs in the other, and every social expectation weighing them down like a chainmail corset. You don't need to feel guilty, just grateful, and maybe pack a snack. In the medieval world, getting lost wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a one-way ticket to the afterlife. You couldn't just pull out your phone and wait for GPS to reroute. There were no blinking blue dots, no Google Maps voice whispering, turn left at the tavern full of drunkards. What you had was the sun, a few vague landmarks, and maybe a hand-drawn map on a scrap of pigskin that looked more like a toddler's drawing of a dragon. And if the clouds rolled in, good luck figuring out where the sun went. Navigation was an act of faith and often desperation. Even seasoned travellers got turned around. Forests all looked the same, big green walls of oops. Hills and rivers changed with the seasons. Paths vanished after a heavy rain or worse, were deliberately obscured by thieves looking to lure you into their trap. If you took one wrong turn, you might wander for hours, then days, and before long you'd be gnawing on pine cones and bargaining with squirrels. Getting lost wasn't just frustrating, it was fatal. The wild didn't care if you had a destination. Inns and villages were often miles apart, and there were no helpful signs saying next, town 6 leagues, beware wolves. Instead, there were forked paths with names like the Devil's Elbow or the Widow's Hollow. Not exactly comforting. And while locals sometimes offered directions, those usually came with a thick dialect and instructions like, just past where the miller's boy drowned, then left by the stump that used to be a tree. Not exactly cartography gold. Worse still, some would deliberately mislead you for a laugh or profit. If you were rich, you might have a guide. But guides got sick, ran off, or died. Some weren't even guides at all, just opportunists who walked faster than you and hoped no one asked questions. Others would lead you part way, then disappear into the mist, leaving you alone with a horse a prayer and the growing awareness that the trees were closing in. And if your horse ran off, that was it. You were officially medieval toast. Religious pilgrims often got lost en route to holy sites. The path to Canterbury wasn't a straight line, and Jerusalem might as well have been on Mars. Maps were decorative suggestions at best, filled with doodles of sea monsters, lions, and moral warnings about pride. A single misplaced compass reading, or a cloudy afternoon, and suddenly your pious journey became a long, confusing stroll into the unknown. For some, the journey never ended. They were found months later, if at all, half-eaten, half-crazy, clutching rosary beads and begging the nearest tree for forgiveness. Travelling merchants fared no better. Trade routes shifted, roads disappeared, and bridges collapsed. A wrong turn could cost weeks of delay, not to mention your entire cart of spices, wool, or questionable cheeses. Bandits waited along paths with few travellers, and guess where people ended up when they got lost? Exactly. You didn't stumble into danger, you walked right into its arms. And once your goods were stolen, you might be left naked, beaten, and very, very directionless. Weather was no help. Fog was the great equalizer. It turned the world into a grey soup, and even locals could vanish in it. Snow erased paths entirely. Rain made landmarks disappear beneath puddles and mudslides. The road ahead could be a path or a pond. It was a coin flip every time. Lightning. That was just nature's exclamation mark that yes, you were going the wrong way, and yes, you might die soon. The psychological toll of being lost shouldn't be underestimated. After a day of wandering, your brain turned on you. Everything looked familiar, and yet not. You began to doubt your memory, your choices, and eventually your sanity. Travellers reported hearing whispers in forests, seeing shadows on the road. That wasn't always superstition. Isolation in the wild does strange things to the mind, especially when you haven't eaten in 2 days, and a bird won't stop judging you. Even rivers could deceive you. Following a stream downstream was common advice, but rivers twisted and meandered, and some led nowhere or worse to the sea. Salt water didn't hydrate. Drownings were common. So were people who got turned around and walked in circles until night fell, and they had to sleep on wet grass under stars that offered no guidance unless you were an astrologer, in which case, congratulations, but you were still lost. There was also the terrifying concept of being officially lost. Monasteries and towns kept records of those who never arrived. After a while, if you didn't show up, they assumed the worst. They might pray for you. They might hold a small service. They might even sell your belongings. But no one was coming to find you. Search parties weren't a thing. The wilderness was vast, unforgiving, and silent. And let's not forget superstition. Being lost was often blamed on spirits, fairies, or curses. Some travellers carried charms or bones to ward off confusion. Others recited prayers at every crossroads, and when you did find a crossroads, you had to pick left, right, or straight ahead. Each road looked the same. Each held the promise of salvation or doom. Most people just guessed and hoped divine providence had better instincts than they did. Sometimes the land itself seemed to shift. Swamps swallowed trails. Mountains were covered in mist for weeks. Roads that had been passable one season became impassable the next. Trees grew over markers. Stones moved. Bridges fell. Even locals got confused if they hadn't travelled recently. It wasn't that you lacked a sense of direction. It was that the world kept hiding the way. Stories of lost travellers became cautionary tales. Don't go out after dark, people said. Don't take the north path, others warned. That's where old Thomas vanished with his mule and his dreams. These tales kept many from travelling at all. And maybe that was the point. Fear kept people local. The unknown was always dangerous, but in medieval times it could also be deadly. Even finding your way back home was perilous. Landmarks looked different from the opposite direction. Villages looked alike. One stone cottage blended into another. If you missed a single turn or someone had moved a fence since your last visit, you could wander past your own home and keep walking for days. Home wasn't where the heart was. It was wherever you managed to stumble into without dying first. The worst part. Sometimes you weren't technically lost, but the people you trusted were. Guides, messengers, and even clergy could take you the wrong way, either by mistake or malice. You could walk with absolute confidence for miles in the wrong direction, and by the time you realised it, turning back was no longer an option. Supplies ran low. Tempers flared. The road became a thin thread stretched across uncertainty. In cities, getting lost was less fatal but still miserable. Streets twisted like drunken spaghetti. There were no maps, no street signs, and houses weren't numbered. Locals gave directions like turn left at the baker, who smells like onions, then find the alley with 3 chickens. Miss one chicken, and you ended up in a completely different district surrounded by shouting carts and the ever-present smell of fish. So what did people do? They prayed. They followed the stars if they could see them. They carried bells to signal distress. They left chalk marks on trees. They made mental notes of oddly shaped rocks. They counted paces. They tied ribbons on branches. Anything to leave a breadcrumb trail, though most of those breadcrumbs got eaten by actual birds. And yet somehow people kept moving. Not all who wandered were lost, but most of them were. And in a world where geography was a rumour and roads were suggestions, survival depended on luck, instinct, and divine mercy. Getting lost was a sentence sometimes short, sometimes drawn out, always dangerous. And when it ended, the world went on without you, quiet, unchanged, waiting for the next fool to take a wrong turn. In the medieval world, the idea of travel insurance was as foreign as indoor plumbing. If you packed for a journey, you didn't bring a policy number. You brought a crucifix, a few coins, and a healthy fear of divine punishment. There were no agents to call if your ox cart got swept away in a river. No hotline if a gang of brigands helped themselves to your bread, boots, and dignity. Compensation for losses that came in the form of long-suffering bitter lessons. Or if you were lucky, miraculous intervention. And if you weren't lucky, well, at least you died with a rosary in hand. Medieval travellers did, however, believe in a kind of supernatural insurance prayer. Before departing, it was common to visit a church, kneel before a saint's image, and plead for safe passage. Some even paid for masses to be said in advance of their trip, as if trying to pre-bribe the heavens. St. Christopher, patron saint of travellers, was an especially busy man, though oddly enough he never showed up when the bandits did. Still folks clung to the hope that his spirit would shoo away wolves, steer storms and guide them to safety, even if he was more often a painting on a wall than a real-life saviour. Blessings were another form of spiritual coverage. A priest would sprinkle holy water on your head, your cart, your mule, possibly even your boots, and wish you Godspeed. But these blessings didn't come with guarantees. If you died en route, that was likely God's plan. If you survived, it was because of your faith. In this way, religion offered something stronger than protection. It offered justification for everything, especially misfortune. Medieval theology was the fine print no one read, but everyone feared. Of course, churches weren't just spiritual safe zones, they were also physical ones. Travellers caught in storms or pursued by enemies could claim sanctuary inside a church. It wasn't foolproof, but it was better than pleading with an angry knight on horseback. Monasteries sometimes gave food and shelter to the weary, the lost, or the nearly dead. They were not required to do so, but charity was good for the soul, and hungry monks were still better company than a roadside gallows. But prayer didn't fill your stomach, it didn't patch your wagon wheel or fend off a fever. In practice, travel insurance was a homemade affair. You packed what you could wore layers, and hoped you'd saved enough for a bribe or two. Coins were more valuable than creeds when dealing with guards, gatekeepers, or highwaymen. You might carry an amulet or charm sewn into your sleeve meant to protect you from sickness or curses. But if your luck ran out, no talisman could stop the spear. There were some practical strategies for self-protection, though they were as crude as they were hopeful. Wealthy travellers hired armed escorts, effectively medieval bodyguards with pointy sticks. Merchants sometimes formed caravans for safety in numbers. But hiring protection was expensive, and not everyone could afford a knight with a broadsword. For the average pilgrim or peasant, safety came down to travelling in groups, walking during daylight, and avoiding roads where corpses were a regular sight. Letters of passage offered some hope. These were documents often from nobles or religious orders attesting to your peaceful intent or social status. In theory, they granted you protection or assistance along the way. In reality, most bandits couldn't read and soldiers didn't care. If your letter was from the wrong lord, or if the road passed through rival territory, your permission became kindling. Paper was not armour. Taverns and inns might offer a moment of shelter, but they were not risk-free. Thieves worked the sleeping quarters as easily as the roadside. Locks were rare, privacy rarer, and you often shared a room with strangers, some of whom didn't wait for sleep to rob you. Insurance here meant keeping one eye open and hiding your valuables in places no one wanted to search, and even that wasn't foolproof. Tales spread of innkeepers who drugged guests and sold their belongings by morning. There were no refunds if you were robbed, poisoned, or left for dead. You couldn't file a complaint or seek legal recourse if your guide vanished with your horse or your ferry capsized in the river. The medieval legal system was slow, corrupt, and mostly inaccessible. Justice, when it came, was often personal, violent, and final. Travel light wasn't a suggestion, it was a survival tactic. The fewer things you had, the fewer things people could take. Unfortunately, that also meant the fewer chances you had to buy your way out of trouble. Some religious orders did offer a primitive form of support. Pilgrims could carry badges or signs indicating their destination, Jerusalem, Santiago, Canterbury, and might receive food or shelter out of pity or reverence. These tokens weren't just symbols of faith. They were social contracts saying, "I'm not here to rob you, just to seek salvation." But if your clothes were too clean or your purse too full, suspicions arose. Real pilgrims looked tired, hungry, and half dead. Looking healthy made you a target. The sick and injured especially had no safety net. If you fell ill on the road, you might be left behind. Compassion wasn't absent, but it had limits. Resources were scarce. No one wanted to carry a stranger who coughed blood or couldn't walk. There were cases of travellers abandoned in ditches with nothing but a wooden bowl and a whispered prayer. Their fate was left to God, the birds, and time. Superstition often filled the gaps where formal insurance failed. People believed certain roads were cursed. Specific days were unlucky to travel. Travellers might delay departure because of a bad omen, a black cat, a sneeze, a crow on the chimney. Some wore herbs for protection, sage for wisdom, garlic for warding off spirits, rosemary for memory. Whether these worked was irrelevant. They offered hope, and hope was a poor man's insurance. If you died while travelling, burial was another matter. Unless someone cared enough to drag your corpse to consecrated ground, you were buried where you fell. Sometimes shallow graves were dug along the roadside, others were left to rot. In some towns, unclaimed bodies were collected weekly like forgotten parcels. Death on the road didn't make you a martyr, it made you an inconvenience. Travel insurance today includes lost luggage, flight delays, and hotel cancellations. In the medieval era, your policy was to not die screaming in a ditch. Success wasn't comfort, it was survival. and when you finally reached your destination alive, unrobbed, and only mildly cursed, it was common to visit a church again, light a candle, and give thanks. Not for luxury, but for simply not being dead. And so despite the perils, people continued to travel. Trade needed to flow, messages needed delivering, and faith demanded pilgrimage. But no one went lightly. Each trip was a gamble with the odds stacked high against you. There were no guarantees, no reimbursements, and no rescue helicopters. If something went wrong, and it often did, the only recourse was prayer grit or a miracle. Because in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't a right, it was a privilege. And on the open road, every step was a prayer. Reaching your destination in the Middle Ages wasn't the triumphant moment we might imagine today. There were no confetti cannons, no clean hotel sheets, no welcome drinks. Instead, you arrived blistered, filthy, probably lice-ridden, with a haunted stare and a vague sense that you were no longer the same person who had started the journey. Your legs ached, your boots were torn, your pouch lighter, your faith tested, and if you were lucky, you still had most of your teeth. And yet, as you limped into a town square, eyes darting for bread and shelter, one realization hit harder than a knight's mace: the trip wasn't over. You had to go back. Medieval journeys were rarely one way. Whether you were a pilgrim returning from a shrine, a merchant closing a deal, or a messenger delivering scrolls sealed with wax and anxiety, your destination was only the halfway point. Unless you had died, which to be fair was quite common, you still had the long road home to endure. Everything you suffered getting there, double it. Only now you were starting the return trip with less money, fewer supplies, a lower tolerance for cold stew, and a strange cough that hadn't been there before. Even the most sacred pilgrimages came with return tickets, unwritten, unpaid for, but grimly understood. Imagine dragging yourself across Europe to Santiago de Compostela, praying at the tomb of St. James, and then turning around to walk all the way back with the same infected blisters but none of the initial optimism. There was no medieval version of stay and relax. Inns charged too much. Locals viewed you with suspicion, and unless you were planning to become a permanent beggar or worse, settle down and marry a stranger, you had little choice but to retrace your bleeding footsteps. It didn't matter whether your journey had been months or years. The way back was just as dangerous, if not more so. You had fewer provisions and even fewer illusions. The shortcuts that looked promising on the way out turned into swamps and regrets. Allies you met on the road were either long gone or dead in a ditch. Your maps, if you even had one, were still hand-drawn fantasies littered with towns that didn't exist and roads that wandered into nowhere. No one sent out a search party. No one cared if you vanished on the way home. Unless you were carrying important news or a relic glowing with divine light, you were just another shadow moving across the earth. Returning travellers were often mistaken for troublemakers. Your clothes were torn, your beard overgrown, your face unfamiliar. Guards at city gates didn't recognise you, and your explanation, "I went to visit a saint and got dysentery instead," didn't always convince them. They might demand a toll, or accuse you of vagrancy, or jail you until someone paid your way. The same road that had barely tolerated your presence now actively conspired to spit you out. You were a walking problem, and people in medieval towns had enough of those already. Even if you managed to stagger back to your home village, you might not receive the hero's welcome you imagined during those long rainy nights sleeping beside your donkey. People moved on. Crops were harvested. Babies were born, and your name had begun to fade into silence. Some might have assumed you died. Others might have taken over your hut. In rare cases, your spouse may have remarried. You'd arrived to find your life rewritten in your absence, and no one asking for a sequel. And if you did make it back with a souvenir, say a relic, a foreign coin, or an exotic disease, you weren't guaranteed thanks. Your neighbours might regard you with awe or suspicion. A relic could be seen as holy or heretical, depending on how the local priest felt that week. Foreign coins were often worthless without the right lord's blessing. And that exotic cough you brought back, congratulations, you just gave the village a new plague. People might burn your possessions, your bed, or even your body. Welcome home. But for some, the journey was the new reality. Pilgrims became permanent wanderers. Outlaws found they preferred the forest to the gallows. Young men who left to become knights often returned broken, or didn't return at all. Travel reshaped people. It didn't merely scar them physically, it reordered their minds. A person who had seen the bustling ports of Genoa or the shrines of Cologne returned to their potato-sized village with a head full of questions and eyes full of horizons. The familiar felt smaller and sometimes unbearable. Those who dared to speak of what they saw were often silenced, not by force but by indifference. Most villagers had never gone more than 10 miles from home. They didn't care about the cathedral's stained glass in Chartres or the salty wind of the North Sea. They didn't want to hear how the bread in France was fluffier or how monks in Rome sang differently. To them, you were either bragging or lying. Either way, you were annoying. So what did you gain from it all? A sore back, a shriveled purse, a new appreciation for not dying? Yes. But also perhaps a strange kind of clarity. Travel was a brutal, unforgiving teacher. It showed you the size of the world and the smallness of your fears. It revealed that survival was not guaranteed and that kindness could be rare but radiant. It stripped you down to your most basic instincts and asked, will you keep walking? And yet, even with all that suffering, many people did it again. Merchants set off on new routes. Pilgrims returned to new shrines. Messengers were dispatched with even heavier satchels. Because movement, for all its terror, was also power. The ability to go to sea to return, that was status. It meant you weren't entirely at the mercy of your village priest or the nearest river. It meant you had lived through something most people wouldn't dare attempt. In the end, finishing a medieval journey didn't mean the danger was over. It meant you'd earned the right to face it again. The road was never truly behind you. It lingered in your scars, your stories, your smell. Your feet itched, your mind wandered. And one day, when the memory of pain faded and the chickens grew boring, you found yourself staring at the horizon once more, wondering what's just beyond that next hill. Because in a world where most people stayed still, the traveller was an anomaly. Mad, brave, or cursed, but never ordinary.